You think this is bad now? This is not as bad as it could get. It could get a lot worse. And as a matter of fact, I've said that for the last 4 years. I've said that in this case too.
Yeah.
Do you think
even
we're at the
this is
bottom
not
yet?
as bad as it could get?
Whoops.
And I expect it will get worse. Just wait. Just wait. Just wait.
Yeah.
Can we call it a dystopia?
Opportunity.
What's the divide and conquer thing is
really, really bad.
It's working too well on us, in America. We're really enthusiastic about going at each other in our different groups and parties rather than trying to figure out what's systemically going on and addressing that. And as long as we keep, going for the red flag, as it were, instead of the sword that's behind it, we're gonna just keep escalating.
Yeah.
What did you just say? You said the red flag or the what behind it? I don't know that.
I can't remember who I'm quoting. It's from the 60s, who said the purpose of politics is to teach you, you're the bull and you're being taught to be excited about the red flag and to charge it and to ignore the sword that's waiting for you.
That was Ginsburg.
Ginsburg, thank you. Yes.
No. Burroughs, William Burroughs.
Burroughs.
Oh, William Burroughs.
Yeah. He said that's the purpose of politics, to teach you the flag.
Yeah, distracting.
Yeah. And I don't know, how many people have read Julius Caesar's Gallic campaign, but it's well worth reading because, first of all, it's short. And second of all, back then, nihilists like to tell you exactly what they were thinking. So they would just say, hi, I don't believe in anything and I'm here to take over and this is how I do it. And so he's in there is one of the first recorded in history, straight out propositions of divide and conquer and how it works. And he says how he used it to defeat the Gauls by fooling them into going after each other and ignoring the fact that Rome was conquering them one after another.
What's the name of the book? I missed it.
The Gallic campaigns. I'll put it in the chat. Yeah, for the Gauls.
Yes. Thank you.
But yeah, he just straight up there says there's always something that people are angry with each other about, and all you have to do is turn that up to 11, and you can get natural allies to turn on each other and then leave themselves vulnerable to you. That's pretty much 20th century PR in a nutshell, right? That's how it works.
Wow.
Who's the bad guy? Oh, they're over there.
I hope everybody's seen Adam Curtis's documentaries.
Like what?
Adam Curtis.
Adam Curtis.
Adam Curtis.
Is the BBC
Watch everything. They're all on YouTube. Watch his documentaries. Adam Curtis.
He's most known for the Century of Self.
Tower of Nightmares, The Trap. They're all good.
I'm trying. Is he saying the Century of Sorrows?
The Century of Self. He's the
Century of Self.
Thank you.
Yeah, the
That's the one.
BBC documentarian.
Tower of Nightmares. Definitely watch. Must
Hypernormalization is really good as well. Hypernormalization.
That's another one. Yeah. But he really talks a lot about how the public are manipulated every step of the way. It goes way back. Yeah.
So we tackled this. Go ahead, Claire.
No. I want to hear. Let's listen. I'm going to listen.
So I think one of the reasons that I'm excited about this particular essay is that the thing about Kenneth's writing is that he makes you do a lot of work to understand what he's saying. Mm-hmm. And he does that work on purpose because the terms that we take for granted and that we use most easily tend to be misleading. They tend to have been programmed into us by our culture. They tend to turn us away from the sword and towards the red flag that's waving. And it is,
the language.
yeah, we have this problem that the tools we're trying to think with and the language that we're using to try to help us do the thinking in the categories have all been pre-formatted for us before we ever become critical thinkers. And we're encouraged always as adults to challenge ourselves by looking beyond to some other future thing that we could be wrestling with. We're never encouraged to turn back around and say, I wonder if all the things that I take for granted are bullshit. I wonder to what extent, the tools I'm working with have already been set out to make sure that no matter what I do with them, I can't actually question the things that most need to be questioned. And it just takes us back to Kierkegaard, right? A delusion is the state of mind in which the thing you most desperately need to think is the one thing that the delusion will not let you think. And cultures do this, right? They turn into little claustral envelopes. We think that we're seeing clearly, all of reality, but what we're actually seeing is the inner surface of the culture and how it has reinterpreted the world for us in order to make the culture itself seem inevitable and complete. And no need to ask any of those hard questions, just stay inside the frame. I think one of the things that in manufacturing consent that Noam Chomsky talks about is that if you try to restrict people's thinking by telling them what they can't think, they'll fight you. But if instead you set an incredibly narrow frame, but then whip up debate inside of that frame, then people will think that they're free because they can see that they're arguing. So they're like, well, how could we possibly be being controlled when we're, I'm taking this position and he's taking that position and we're going at it and we're thinking as fiercely as we can. It's like, yeah, but only in this narrow space over here that never actually questions the things that most need to be questioned. So that's what's going on with Kenneth Smith's writing. Is he's trying to write in a way that keeps pulling the frame back into focus, which feels unnatural to us because all of our natural ways of thinking and talking have been designed to ensure that we don't ever look at the frame, that we stay inside of it and think that we're free, even if we're in a tiny, narrow space.
He's also applying this style of writing I'm accustomed to seeing in research papers, analytical scientific research papers. The rhythm and the language and dissection of each element of it. So I noticed that right off the top, like, oh, okay. So I'm reading, one of these papers that they want me to think they're smart, and they are, but having done that kind of reading and, written, literature reviews and that sort of thing, I recognized that cadence, that rhythm, that pulling of each section and taking, like you're undoing a sweater. You're taking each section and pulling apart the threads.
Right.
And saying, well, look, these were threads.
Exactly.
And
Look
it's not one color, it's three.
Exactly. Exactly. And you can see it at the start of each of these sections when he pauses on the previous topic and then goes back to the beginning and says, now let's talk about how the Greeks saw things. Okay, we're done with that. Now let's put that away. And now let's talk about how the moderns see things. And then as he builds up each of those three worldviews, he's able to pit them against each other and say, so what would the medievals think of the ancients? And what would the medievals think of the moderns, and vice versa? And that's hard for us because we're encouraged in the modern world to think that we don't need to change standpoints because our standpoint is the most advanced. It's at the pinnacle of history. We see more scientifically, more objectively, more correctly, more completely. We're more educated. We're smarter. We're taught this incredible body of self-flattery that we are told is not self-flattery at all. It's just objective truth, that we are better.
We're encouraged to be ethnocentric.
We are, while being told that we're not. It's a weird kind of
while being in denial.
Those aren't blinkers; those are lenses, right? You're not. You haven't lost the ability to see things from other people's perspective. You don't need those perspectives because they're inferior and yours is the best. You see things clearly, and so it makes it really uncomfortable when he, instead of taking the modernist perspective, which is that we begin from the modern perspective and we warp the other ones to fit within our worldview, he then turns it around and says, oh yeah? Well, what would a medieval had to say about the modern world? And then our skin is crawling, hair's going up on the back of our neck. And we're like, I'm not comfortable right now. You can't question the things that you're questioning. You're not able to ask those things. But because he's already introduced, that the medieval perspective is grounded in grace rather than, in ego, he's like, well, what would grace have to say about these things? What do these things mean from the perspective of grace? So it's like I'm trying to figure out how it's like a kind of dread, a cognitive dread, because you can see that you're about to do something really uncomfortable, and you're going to do it using uncomfortable language and categories. And everything we've been trained is that we should do what makes us happy and comfortable. We should go with the flow and not question the hard things, and not, as Kenneth Smith likes to say, not dislocate the joint of our mind so that we can turn it around to look at itself, which it's not accustomed to doing. So
yeah, I never. That must be why. Okay.
Says that's why it doesn't feel good. You're on the trail of the important stuff when you get that uncomfortable feeling.
Yeah.
It's like going into an intellectual haunted house or something like that.
Yeah. I guess I'm fortunate in that I came from insanity. They wouldn't make a Lifetime movie about it. And so, and I have a peculiar analytical IQ. And so it came to me right away in my 20s, for example, my value system, to write a list of all these values. And then I wrote the name next to everybody that I thought they came from and whether or not they were actually mine.
Traceability.
Did I actually buy this? I came down to 3 values.
Right?
Yeah. So, and I want to tease things apart when I'm talking to people all the time. And they do get really uncomfortable. So this is why.
Yeah. So this essay was made for you because, this is what Kenneth loves to do. This is the thing that he does more than any philosopher I've read is he's constantly not telling you what he thinks. He's constantly saying, well, what would Kierkegaard say about this? What would Nietzsche say about that? What would Heraclitus say about that? And if a topic comes up or somebody makes a proposition, what he wants to do is before he responds to it, he wants to say, well, it's interesting that you raised that because, Kant had something to say about that. And when Kant said that, he was arguing with Descartes. And it's like he sets up these, these threads and tries to show you where do these ideas come from so that we stop thinking that they're ours. We stop taking them for granted and we start to treat them like something objective that we could ask questions about, that it's not so scary to question, right? Because somewhere, it's not just the modern world, but as moderns, we have this as well. There are deep questions that we don't really want to tinker with because we sort of sense that too many things are based on them in our lives. And if we tug on that thread, then we're going to maybe tug on every thread. And we're not ready for that. We have our lives to get along with, right? We have to do our jobs. We have to get our income. We have to eat our meal. We have to raise our kids. We don't have time to go back to the beginning and say, well, what if I had to rethink absolutely everything important in my life because I had it wrong and it was all based on this flaw? Let's just not think about that.
I now make decisions based on that
right.
ego, those experiences. Now I interpreted them.
So we've got this powerful negative to try to drive us away from pulling on certain threads in our own minds. So we don't like where they would lead us. Kierkegaard talked about this too. This is the subjective and the objective, where he says, our own subjectivity that we use to understand the world, we tend to treat it as a precious, favored thing that we try to defend from critique. Whereas other people's subjectivities, we treat them as objective. That's somebody out there with some opinion that we need to dissect and criticize and show them how they're wrong and mistaken, but not ours. And that we flip back and forth between doing this unconsciously without even realizing that we're putting up walls around our own ideas while we're, being objective about theirs. And he says, to be philosophical, one of the most important things you have to do is invert that relationship. and say, well, what if we weren't so worried about attacking other people's ideas? I mean, we could trace their pedigree and try to understand them, but the point's not to beat them, because we don't need to defend our ideas. But we put our ideas out there on the chopping block and treat them objectively and say, well, they're maybe not ours anyway. We don't even know where they came from. Let's trace them through and figure out how this stuff got into our heads so that we can make a decision about where to go from here. So that's going all over this essay, right? That's from beginning to end. That's what he's doing in this essay. He's saying one of the challenges that we have is that, throughout the history of the world, we have no idea how many distinct, coherent worldviews there have been that aren't just little variants of each other, but that are, in some ways alien to each other at a fundamental values level, such that if we could get into that worldview, we could see the world from a new angle. Everything would light up with different values, and it might make us ask questions that are unquestionable to us otherwise. And we don't know, without all those perspectives, we don't know just how constrained our understanding of ourselves and the world is. So what he's doing in this essay is he's saying, he can document 3. There's doubtless lots more, and there's probably even more that could be documented. Like, you'll see there's no African, there's no Asian, there's no Australian, there's no pre-Columbian, America's perspectives in this. This is strictly Europe, and is strictly over a time frame of 3,000 to 4,000 years. But he's picking that not because he thinks it's best, but because he can document that part. And because he can document it in enough detail, he can allow us or help us to get out of the one that we're stuck in and into one of the other 2 completely enough that we're not just faking it, that we're not just warping them and turning them into primitive versions of ourselves, that we can really see from those perspectives and get some perspective on ourselves. So that's why he's tackling these 3 and not others. My wife and I were talking about this. Why not indigenous cultures? Why isn't there a discussion here of Native American cultures? And it's because, well, he's got these 3, he's got them documented. And the important trick is to learn to get ourselves out of the one that we're locked into and to shift between different modes. Once we do that, it's up to us to go find the rest of them and to try to figure out what we can learn from those perspectives and to add to the philosophy that way. And we've all got parts that we can play in this. This isn't about him trying to give us received wisdom that we then, say, yes, Kenneth, you're a very smart person. It's on the contrary. He's just trying to teach us the trick of getting out of the one cage that we're in and being able to change perspectives. So that's what this essay's about. And of course, along the way, he's going to say a tremendous amount of controversial and uncomfortable things. But that's a means to an end. So what are people's thoughts initially about what you read? Anyone who has an opinion?
I really enjoyed the whole thing about grace. It like gave me like a nutshell piece about what it is and why it's so attractive. What's attractive about it? Because I thought like this is just garbage, but it like kind of let me see, oh, that's what they're, the teeth they're sucking on. I see why it's so attractive.
Yeah, he puts grace into a positive perspective here, doesn't he? Which is interesting because, from the modernist perspective, the medieval worldview isn't any more valid than the ancient one. The one of the things that we talk about in these Kenneth Smith sessions on the Mondays is that what distinguishes these epochs is how they rank 3 priorities for sources of meaning: nature, God, and man. And where do you look to for direction? And in the ancient world, it was nature first, because they believed that the gods were aspects of nature and that human beings were subject to both the gods and to nature generally. And that the revolution of the medieval era was overthrowing nature and proclaiming that there's only one God, and furthermore, he created nature. He existed before nature, unlike the ancient gods. And so therefore, you shouldn't bother with nature. You should focus on God as the source of meaning. And then below that, man as the custodian of God, and nature as the creation that we're supposed to take care of. And then Pico della Mirandola's revolution, the Renaissance revolution, is overthrowing God and putting man on top and saying, well, we can have science and we can have laws and we can make agreements and we can decide for ourselves what our priorities are. And then nature and God then just become choices you might make or might not make. So this really, if you rank those three sources of meaning in those three different ways, you make very different choices about the world. They're inherently alien to each other, even though we can trace the relationships and the lineage. They give you very different answers about things. So what he wants to do here is not present the medieval worldview the way moderns are used to it as a dark age, that thank God we overcame it. And now we're all enlightened now. They were stupid. He's doing the opposite. He's saying, what was it that they saw from their perspective that we can't see from our perspective? Because we don't acknowledge any other source of meaning outside ourselves. We take for granted the idea that the human mind is this perfect objective source that we can use to reach conclusions and priorities. But what if that's not true? What if there are other sources of meaning? And then what would our relationship be to them? So I like the way that he talks about grace here, because if you've read much Kenneth Smith, you know he quotes Nietzsche a lot. He's read a lot of Nietzsche. He brings Nietzsche into play, and Nietzsche was enraged by Christian hypocrisy around him in Germany and the rise of what would eventually turn into, the Third Reich later. The way that Christians in Germany at that time in the 19th century would cozy up to militants and to jingoists and nationalists and try to make a happy blend. And he's like, what would Jesus have to say about all of you people doing these things? So you'll see Kenneth Smith quote frequently, he criticizes Christian hypocrisy, but you wouldn't get that from the opening of this essay in about grace and the Christian ethos. Because here he's saying, well, leaving aside hypocrisy and corruption, what is it they're actually trying to do? What is, and you can criticize anybody based on how they fall short of their ideals, but what are their ideals? What are they trying to do?
It's kind of interesting correspondence with the evangelicals nowadays in America, right? Who are supporting the Trump and the Republican Party. And it sounds just very, very much like what you were saying about what happened in Germany, the Christians cozying up to with the, the Reich, Third Reich and the militants.
Right.
Over two issues that.
Yeah, shoot.
Well, I mean, at least in the USA, when and probably most of the world now, or throughout history, when we say Christianity, we aren't talking about one thing. We never are, because the Christians morph, they break off into different groups. They, and some lean more on grace. Some lean more toward very strict about the word, and he had another. I wish I hadn't hit my head. Logos. Yeah. So, and it's disheartens me that there's this these Taliban Christian out there. And that's what I call them. There's nowhere in the Logos does it say, go take my teachings and create a government. But they're so obsessed on these two issues that they're willing to sell out everything else, every other value of feed sick, heal the sick, feed the poor, what are you going to do with all these unwanted kids and addicted kids? And, they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it's maddening to watch, especially if you happen to be a Christian that, doesn't belong to the cult of Christianity, but is in a much simpler walk. And it's just, it does make you angry. It really does.
Yeah.
It really does.
When Nietzsche wrote God is Dead, everybody accused him of saying that he wished God were dead, or that he killed God or wanted to kill God. And he was saying, no. Nietzsche saying, my dad was a preacher. and I'm looking around me at how Christianity is practiced as opposed to what Jesus asked us to do. And what I'm seeing is that as a source of moral authority, you put God in second place now. You're first concerned about nationalism and private advantage and military strength and all of these other, social standing, all of these other priorities of modernism you've put ahead of God. And therefore, you've killed God as the source of power. And so this is where Nietzsche is talking about the break between the medieval and the modern epochs. He's saying we want to rewrite the past as though it's just a primitive lead-up version to the present, and it has no existence of its own. But the medieval era had its own logic. It was at one time a fresh revolution against the ancient world by putting God first, and it did that on the theory that the problem with the ancient world that the Christians saw, especially in Rome, was the capacity for human corruption. And they said, well, what can't be corrupted is God. God can't be corrupted. And so instead of letting people be in charge when they're so corruptible, we ought to put something incorruptible in charge, a source of values and truth that, is never going to be false, that we can always rely on. That was the original revolution back around, 180, 280, whenever you want to place it, when it became a movement and not just a guy. That was what the push was. But what Nietzsche saw around him in Germany in the 19th century is all these German Christians who absolutely would not, they were not willing to criticize, the powers that be that were around them. They weren't willing to lose everything they had in order to pursue the truth or to do the right thing. And that, therefore, if we wanted to understand, this is to go to Lucas's point in the chat, if we wanted to try to understand what the medieval revolution was about, we can't try to understand it from the sorry examples we have today. We have to look at what they were angry about when they started their revolution. What were they fighting for? What were they trying to accomplish? And even though we're never going to succeed in putting ourselves into that mind space because we were born in this mind space, just the work, like in yoga or martial arts or any physical discipline, just the work of stretching our brains to try, to look for our assumptions and to try to overcome them and to get closer to what were they thinking, what were they trying to do and to become. That's good for us. It helps to unlock our brain and to be able to see from more perspectives. Although I would agree with Lucas, we're never going to become medievals. We're never going to truly see from that angle. But maybe we can see from somewhere between where we are and where they are, far enough that we get a little bit of parallax from our default perspective, enough to see that there are other perspectives, even if we never truly recreate the old ones. They're just different directions to stretch in.
I read this as a scathing critique of modern ego, and
yeah,
I wonder if he really thinks that we've fallen into a cultural dark ages because we have lost our the center of what our values should be, and that center was once encoded and passed down through religion, and then was encoded and passed down sort of subliminally through our cultural institutions, and these would be works of great art or media, that type of significance. And now in the modern era, since we are turned towards ourself and we've elevated our ego above everything, there are no values that we share in common, and they aren't being passed down effectively. In fact, some of the things that we quote unquote value are sort of inversions of what real values might have been. And he actually advocates for a lineage of values, saying that it's possible to say that something is better than something else, and that this is at odds with this modern dialectic and this sort of political correctness that's evolved, where everything is supposed to be on an equal footing, and to rank modes of thought is almost seen as, offensive. So this is making it almost impossible for us to have values and hence meaning in life, especially since these prior two institutions have been degraded. That's kind of what I read here, and I thought it was incredibly relevant and forward looking, especially for the time it was written.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with your take on that. I think that's right. He's trying to he's trying to continue and expand what Nietzsche and Kierkegaard were doing. I don't know. Have any of you read Kierkegaard's Attack on Christendom? Do you know about that one?
No.
It's a series of essays he wrote to the newspaper, his local Danish newspaper, late in his life, and later it was collected into a volume called Attack on Christendom. That wasn't his name, but it was aptly chosen because here's Kierkegaard, who spent his whole life trying to do ultra rigorous Hegelian dialectical philosophy to explain religion and the importance of a spiritual life. And he's turning on Christianity and criticizing it left and right, just article after article after article. It's like, well, why would he do this? Why would the premier philosopher of Christianity go after Christianity? It turns out it's because it's the same reason Nietzsche said God is dead. He was just infuriated by the people around him in Denmark who claimed to be Christians, and they wanted the social benefits of being called Christians and the economic benefits and the political benefits, but they didn't actually want to do anything that Christ told them to do. He didn't actually want to challenge. They didn't want to challenge their own standing or money or anything else in order to sacrifice for doing the right thing. And it's fascinating to see because, if you read Kierkegaard when he was younger, you would not necessarily have predicted that that was going to be his last writing. He spent the last years of his life writing this whole series of just really angry attacks. But once you've read those angry attacks, you go back and read earlier Kierkegaard, you have the exact opposite reaction. You could see this coming his whole life long, because he's constantly talking about religion, how it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to connect us to values, and how it's supposed to help us to not let our stomachs be our gods, not let our wallets be our gods, and to try to live for something greater than just our own temporary lives that are so brief. And then the clearer you get in being able to picture that, the harder it is to reconcile it with what's around you. It's like when you have a vague sense of right and wrong, the people doing bad things around you isn't particularly bothersome. It's just sort of vaguely uncomfortable. But the crisper you get in your understanding of ethics, the more you understand the terrible consequences of the things you took for granted that are all around you. And the more you see, you know what, I have to stop this. Somebody has to stop this. It has to be criticized. We have to take a stand against it. So there's this eruption of spirit late in his life when he suddenly has a direction. A little too late. It would be interesting to see if he'd lived another 10 years, how that would have manifested over time. But,
So does Ken Smith offer a prescription out of this sort of cultural decay? He doesn't in this essay, but I'm just curious if in any of his other works, if you're familiar with how he tries to resolve this issue.
So what he argues in favor of doing is learning to, you have to study the difficult philosophers and the difficult epochs that we're not comfortable putting our minds into. You have to see how they're different than we are. You have to see among those differences, what are the good differences? Where do we have serious problems that they had less of a problem because of some strength of that perspective or epoch? And then from those, you have to sort of synergistically cobble together the sense that there is some healthy, culture or potential culture waiting for us that we just have not figured out how to put the pieces together for. So it's as though you had although he would never use this term, I think from a modernist intuitive perspective, it would make sense, as though you had a science of ethics or a science of culture in which you actually tried to study the variety that was out there and to learn from it. And part of the reason he wouldn't use that particular terminology is that he sees science as we practice it as being very different from the science that we claim it is. For example, our science is market driven. It's about generating profit for corporations who can fund science. We don't think that's what it's about, except that's where all the money is that goes into science. It's if you're doing pure scientific research for the benefit of humanity, you find your funding dries up pretty fast. And so on. So he wouldn't approve my use of that terminology, but I think just to get an intuitive sense of what his prescription is, that's part of it, right? That's part of it. part of it is just to get ourselves free, because until we're free of the shackles of our minds that our cultures have made for us, we're not going to get anything else done. Where, you know, everything that we do is going to end up being bent back around to serve the culture that we're part of, that we take for granted. And so that sort of self-liberation is the first step. And not liberation as in you can't do anything until you are free, because we're never going to be free from what we grew up in. It's always going to be a part of us. It's down in the foundations of our mind. Our initial categories, our initial values, and our wants, our drives have already been preconditioned by the time we start asking questions. So it's not freedom like that, but it's freedom like an agon, a struggle. He says what characterizes. Let me just, I'll pop him in here. He brings them up over and over: douloi, banausoi, and aristoi. Right? These are the three mentalities that come naturally to human beings. They're easy to fall into, and our culture is mostly made out of the first two and mostly stamps out the third kind because it would be disruptive. So the douloi are the people who assume that what they feel probably leads them to the truth. My drives, my impulses, my desires, I get what I want, and by doing that, life is good. The banausoi are the ones who don't trust their feelings and drives, and so they seek refuge in systems of thought, logic, reason, in the law, in power structure, social climbing, basically an abstraction from the world, an abstraction from themselves, and that's pretty much how the modern world is governed. The modern world is governed and structured by banausoi in order to prey upon douloi. Large masses of douloi generate profit for small numbers of banausoi. That's modernism in a nutshell. So what he says that distinguishes the third type, the aristoi, from those two types, is that first of all, they recognize that both of those are half-wit perspectives. Each of them is like being a cyclops with one eye's covered. You can't get binocular vision on the world if you retreat entirely into your feelings and drives, and you can't get it if you retreat entirely into your abstractions and your ideas and your reasons and systems. But furthermore, the truth isn't in between, somewhere between them. They're both limited. If we're looking for sources of meaning, we have to look outside of the limits of our mind, our emotional limits and our intellectual limits, for something else, and that's not going to come naturally to us. So we have to struggle for it. What defines the aristoi as a mentality is that they're struggling against what comes naturally in order to escape the trap that we're born into. And where exactly that leads, this is when you talk about a prescription, this is what's different about Kenneth from most philosophers who prescribe things. He's not prescribing the endpoint. He's not like drawing a little circle and say, this is utopia and we should go there. What he's saying is, this is the nature of the problem we're stuck in. And so the solution has to be that away, but you're all going to have to find it. You're going to have to struggle, each of you, from your own perspective. He recognizes that, growing up in Texas in the 20th century, he's got his own labyrinth that he's struggling to escape. And it means that he's going to have certain blind spots that disqualify him from being able to lay out some kind of perfect prescription for how humans can be happy and have a great culture, and that other people will have different blind spots, and some of them will be able to see into things he can't see. And so the important thing is not that he give us the answers, but to sort of point in the direction and describe the nature of the struggle and what we have to overcome, so that we then, as we move forward, can start supplying pieces that we discover.
I think, he is pointing to a direction, like with the Greek thing, that it's, it's an inversion of our culture, which is that suffering, is what's pointing to where one has to go, that the wisdom is in the suffering. And I think, in cultural and high art and stuff, that's just, they're symbols of valiant efforts at suffering. That's what high art is just symbols of someone really digging in there in the suffering and finding the wisdom, and that's such a, an opposite view of the modern view, which is suffering. No, get away from that. How do we avoid that? But no, the suffering is saying, hey, over here is the material. This is what you need to engage with.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the agon, right? The struggle that
Yes.
that characterizes the aristoi.
Yeah, Nietzsche. Yeah.
Yes, and it's based on the premise that Well, Heraclitus, right? It would not be better if men got exactly what they wanted, because we don't want the right things. We don't know what we should want. We take for granted that our wants must somehow be divinely pointing us in the correct direction. You know how widespread in America is the myth that if you are hungry or if you have a craving for something, it must be because it contains nutrients that you're missing, and that therefore you are naturally drawn to it. So if I want to eat Reese's peanut butter cups all day, there must be something wonderful in chocolate or peanuts that I'm deficient in, and that therefore I should get it. We teach in the modern era, we teach to the douloi this idea that they should love their wants and embrace their wants and trust their wants as the source of all truth and authority, where the Greeks thought the opposite. We naturally want things that aren't good for us. Some percentage of our wants are good wants, but we don't know which ones those are because they're mixed up with all the bad wants. And so we have to learn to deal with our wants, not cynically, but let's say skeptically. Like it's something to learn about and explore, to distinguish the good from the bad and the better from the worse, and when are we on target and when are we off target.
Right, and that the good is the bad, to like just flip it. That's the question to do. The want, it's going in this direction, but it's really heading from where you should be heading back toward.
Right. Yeah, Claire, go ahead. Come off mute. What's up, Claire?
Oh, I just wanted to comment on your food thing, if I may, which is kind of going on
Please.
a little rant. But they've shown that there was some study that I read that they gave like 2-year-olds a buffet of all healthy foods, fruits and vegetables, and they cured themselves of illnesses by eating one thing. And there's also an age point that if they're lost in the forest, children are lost in the forest, they will survive longer the less they know, because they don't have the fear of what they're going to eat. And also this bounces off of this idea that we have these microbes also that we discussed about, a week or whenever that was. We have this like kind of flora in us that this is a synergy that sometimes I feel like we're craving what our flora wants.
Yes.
But there is a natural intuition that we can listen to that is the intelligence of nature that we're part of. But the problem is that sugar is a drug. So that's like saying, well, a heroin addict's always craving heroin because you want Reese's peanut butter cups.
Right. It could be the sugar.
That's like not a great example. That's like saying, well, I'm craving crack all day, So
Yeah,
that theory doesn't work.
Right.
About food. Food is natural. We're meant to eat. Animals are meant to eat food, and animals. I have chickens, and they naturally. They didn't come from like a structure. They didn't have a mother hen to teach them.
Right.
So they naturally had to like taste all the weeds and the plants in my yard, to like figure out and we have that. And I've like kind of had experiences with myself where if you fast for a few days, you do a hard reset of your body and you get completely off of sugar for a couple of weeks. That intuition that comes in then what to eat is generally like real talk, body real talk. Yeah.
Yes.
So just throwing that idea out there. You probably already were feeling
I'm glad
that.
you said it. That's right on the money, right? There's that, just like the way our minds can be warped to crave things that aren't good for us by our culture, if our culture is exploitative. In the same way, our flora can be thrown out of balance if we're fed a diet of the wrong things. We start to crave the wrong things. But it's fascinating to see what happens after a fast. If you do a fast that's long enough that you really get through the glycogen reserves in your liver and actually start, metabolizing your fat, your flora balance changes because the short-lived flora that depend upon the hit of the sugar die off, and you're left with more resilient flora that are able to withstand famine. And are thinking in their little microbial way about longer term goods. You come back into the food and some of your cravings are gone. So there's a similar thing here about the thing that's interesting about human beings is how malleable we are. We sort of it's like breathing, right? Is it voluntary or is it involuntary? Well, it's kind of some of both, right? There's a baseline of involuntary response to your breathing that'll keep you oxygenated, but you can mess with it. And you could be taught to mess with it in good ways that help you to dive or swim, but you could be taught to mess with it in bad ways that hurt you. It all depends on what you've learned. And so human beings are highly vulnerable to our acculturation. It's very important that our acculturation kind of be health promoting and goodness promoting and not sickness promoting or evil promoting, because if you get us early enough and you work on us enough, you can turn us into little Nazis. You know, we will do that if that's what the culture molds us into. Or we could, you know, we could become wonderful people who take care of the earth and each other. It all depends. There's this huge variability. So when Patrick talks about the ways in which, you know, the Kenneth Smith is critiquing the modern world as being the opposite of the ancient world in terms of its values. One of the ways that that's true is that in the ancient world, at least the ancient Greeks, when they were forming the Olympian religion with the 12 gods on Mount Olympus, and when they were crafting the Iliad and the Odyssey and setting up the Olympic Games and the other three every 4-year games, and basically the entire structure of what became classical Greek civilization, you know, they did that deliberately. One of the things we don't appreciate, we assume they're like any other culture, they just happen to be the way that they were, but that's absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. They during the Dark Age, at the end of the Greek Dark Age, they manufactured a culture for themselves on purpose, and we've got traces of this documented about the fact that they did this, and the reason that they did it is they all knew about the Golden Age, the Mycenaean and Minoan era that preceded their Dark Age. They knew that they used to have indoor plumbing and hot water. They knew that they used to be literate. They had this understanding of the heights to which they had reached. And they also knew that they didn't lose it because of outside conquerors. This is the thing about the Greeks that's so different from us. They knew that they trashed their own culture. They knew that the way that their heroic age worked and the values that they had and the things they thought were important led them into a series of civil wars, the Trojan War, a whole bunch of others, to just destroy everything that was important and destroy it so completely that they plunged themselves into a dark age that lasts 500, 700 years, and that they lost almost everything, and that they had fallen to barbarism. There was highway robbery, there was cannibalism, widespread rape, illiteracy. They were back to being clumsy and crude and stupid. And a group of them got together and said, this is just intolerable. How can we have fallen so far from such a height? What we need to do is we need to redesign our culture in such a way that we will never do that again. we need to build into ourselves the striving to do better than we are now. And we can hold up that golden age as a golden age, but we also have to critique it as a tragedy. That's what was it about those heroes that led them to turn on each other, and how can we avoid doing that? So they wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they created all of these tragedies that they wrote that tried to explore the limits and liabilities of the human mind. Even an Aristos, even the best that a person could be, how do they still cause tragedies to happen? Where are the limits? And then they set it in motion, and that's where classical Greece came from. Is this process of cultivation? They have a couple of terms here, which I've mentioned before. I'll put them in the chat. One term is anthropoculture. That's a Greek term, and it means the cultivation of human beings. So like horticulture or viniculture or any other culture, they're like, one of the jobs of human beings is to cultivate human beings. It should be our job to try not to let people be the worst that they can be, because people at their worst are horrible. We're not beasts, we're worse than beasts. Like you were saying, Claire, that the animals in nature are drawn to the foods that are healthy for them. And they're drawn to the behaviors that they've evolved into, that have allowed them to be here after 1 billion years of evolution. But human beings are even more variable than that, and they can get themselves into a mindset in which they tear everything apart. And nothing could be more important than cultivating people so that we don't do that, and instead we do the other thing. Right? It should be the highest aspiration of humanity to try to help figure out which way is good, which way is health, which way makes the world better, and try to help each other go that way. Not in a limited lockstep, totalitarian way, but in an exploring, searching, humbly, but recognizing the importance of things. They called that project Paideia, kids stuff. Nothing. Aristotle said, anyone who studied the fate of nations and empires knows that nothing could be more important than the education of the children. You have to try to get kids pointed in a healthy, good direction from a young age so that they're not all tearing at each other as adults. So to that end, they thought music should support that. Drama and theater should support that. Architecture should inspire us and support that. Our literature should support that. Our politics should support that. Our society, every single tool we have at our disposal for culture should be pointing in the direction of, healthiness and happiness and being better people and struggling to do good. So to Patrick's point, which I think is right on the money, what do we do with all those things in the modern era? Music is to make a buck. Literature is to make a buck, right? Politics has become corrupted and it's to make a buck. The economy is to make a buck. Everything is for personal advantage. Like everything serves ego. And whoever has the greatest ability to manipulate the world can satisfy their ego and their appetites more than anybody else. This is the modern world we've constructed in opposition to the ancient world. And we're not even shy about it, right? Televangelists, send me your money. Why is there religion? So that I can get rich and live in a mansion and have 5 yachts. That's God wants you to give me your money. This is Nietzsche's God is dead in a nutshell. It's like that. You can call that Christianity, but that's not Christianity. If you really study, the people who made the medieval world happen, who were struggling against the corruption of Rome, this wasn't what they had in mind. They didn't say we must overthrow Rome so that we could be even more corrupt than Caligula. That's worth fighting for. That was not their revolution, right?
Yeah.
So this is what he's getting at here in these essays. Well, how did the world look like from each of these perspectives? And then what does the modern world look like from their perspectives?
Kind of a one-dimensional thought process, right? Of being always focused on accumulating wealth, and that you have to accumulate as much wealth as you, and that's your only. It's like that's your only purpose in life, is to do that.
Yes.
And disregarding everything else. Everything else is a means.
Yeah. Go ahead, Claire.
I was just going to ask a question to hear. Like I was raised a Christian, as I've already shared, and I feel like I've been thinking a lot about the book of Revelation and how we can become self-fulfilling prophecies because of our belief system, and that Christianity is embedded in the state's consciousness, and how the last chapter of the book is Revelation. And it's kind of the endpoint where it culminates. And it's a horrible, terrible, frightening book. And it was written by a guy that at the time, I think wanted to conjure up his people to go to war, but that's not advertised in in Christianity. It's just that the images for me were really, really embedded. I studied the Watchtower and Bible and Tract Society have a book called Revelation, the Grand Climax is at Hand. And it's full of terrifying images. I was homeschooled at the time. I didn't have access to any other information or teachers, and it was crammed down my throat. And the book still scares me.
Yeah.
And there's a specific, so I kind of deconstruct things idea by idea, and other people that come from very closed belief systems have a tendency to not do that. They'll just throw out the whole thing.
Right.
And I just wanted to offer up one of the things that are in the book of Revelation to see if everybody else could kind of deconstruct it for me, if that's okay with other people as well.
Sure, give it a shot.
There's the 8-headed beast, and the 7 heads are all the world powers and what they had to offer, and that the seventh head is the Anglo kind of American UK world power, and then the eighth head is the United Nations, which also I perceive to be as consumerism as a whole, and like to me it's just like the homogenous kind of culture we've created, you know, through the internet and modern day. So the United Nations, and then the United Nations kind of turns on the harlot, which is the Christendom as they define it. This isn't my belief system. This is just what I was taught, people.
Yeah.
But it still lingers, and it's like, so Christendom is the harlot, and the harlot is world religion, and then the United Nations essentially turns on religion in the last days. It gets to a point where there's like this realization that it's not serving them anymore, and they turn on religion, and it's this horrible, gory, destructive, miserable thing that happens where it's like pure human torment for a while, and then like pretty much like Jesus and the angels like just wretchedly destroyed the earth as we know it, and we're all sinners, so we're gonna go. So,
Right.
and that's like, but because I see common themes that I resonate with that in that analogy, I would love to hear, like, you know, what do you think that, you know, this author would say about that? What do you think that the Greek philosophers would say about that, to give me some other perspectives on it?
Sure.
If the group doesn't mind.
So part of what's so interesting about that particular book is when the canon was being formed, which is around 4th century, I think, they spent a bunch of time generating books. I posted a link to earlychristianwritings.com. It's a friend of a friend who researches what are all of the discovered apocrypha that didn't make it into the canon, not just the ones that made it into the Catholic apocrypha, the official apocrypha, but then an endless list of additional books that people were writing in the first 4 centuries after Christianity, and many of which had, you know, big circulation at the time, and you would have thought they would have ended up in the canon, yet somehow they didn't. And what's in them, and how do you compare them to what's in there? It's fascinating just to get your mind into the mindset of that era and see, you know, what were people concerned about? Because what we're getting in the canon is just a selection that people thought would make for a good religion. I mean, to be fair, they picked out of hundreds of books and said, I don't know about this one. This one's kind of crazy. I don't think this will lead to anything good. Let's put that in the Apocrypha. But this one, I don't like this group over here, and this book says they're bad, so I'm going to put this one in. For example, you can see in Mark and Matthew, they have Jesus say opposite things about whether Christians are supposed to follow Jewish law. And that's because there was an enormous argument in the early Christian community about, you know, could you become a Christian without being circumcised? If you're an adult man, this is a relevant question. You know, like, do I want to be a Christian? Well, I don't know. Put that knife away, right? So they had two different groups. And one group said, you know, look, Christianity is a Jewish religion. You have to follow all of Jewish law in order to be Christian. And if you don't do that, you can't be a Christian. That was one group. And the other group was, that's terrible. If you do that, we're never going to get any of these adult men to join. They're all going to be crossing their legs going, back off, mister. So that group said, no, you know, Jesus came to overturn the law and to replace it with love and following God. And so you can find Jesus saying exactly opposite things in Mark and Matthew. But the reason both books are in there is because the people who built the canon couldn't reconcile the two with each other, and enormous communities were supporting each of those gospels. So if they left one out, Christendom would be shrunk. They'd lose an enormous number of people who'd fish it off. So as a compromise, they put them both in there side by side, even though they exactly say opposite things about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. So when it came to the Apocalypse of John, Revelations, almost nobody wanted to include it. They said, that John was on serious drugs. This is a batshit crazy political commentary. It was talking about the relationship between the Roman Empire and early Christianity, and would the Romans come and destroy us? You know, Nero is widely seen to be the Antichrist. Probably the references to the Antichrist are references to Nero. The Whore of Babylon. All of these things are references to different political groups at the time, and who was fighting with whom. But it just barely squeaked out on the vote, and they included it. And the reason they included it was there were too many people into the Apocalypse of John Just like the two gospels where they couldn't leave out one because it contradicted the other. They couldn't leave out the Apocalypse of John because too many people were into it. And they're like, this has to be part of the canon. We're going to go ahead and include it, even though there's a whole bunch of other apocalypses, which you can see on that website I linked to, that were left out. This was the one that was the most popular of the group. And so they let it stay in. Now, what's fascinating is when you listen to modern apocalyptic people, Christians of the apocalyptic variety, who are really into Revelations and the end times, they will sometimes tell you that the Antichrist is a reference to the Emperor Nero, and that it was talking about contemporary events, but they almost never do that. They almost never put themselves into the mindset of the actual readers and authors of the time. What they do instead is they do what modernism does to previous cultures. They project our concerns onto the book and mentally rewrite it so that now it's talking about the United Nations and the US versus Russia and all this stuff that the author of the Apocalypse of John just absolutely was not talking about, right? It's like none of that was on his mind when he was writing that. This is what this is about. It's a case study of one of the things that the Greeks warned us about. And I'm just going to put it in the chat. I mention it almost every week, which is the bed of Procrustes. The bed of Procrustes, right?
Yeah.
The villain who won't let people get a good night's sleep in his bed, even though he's supposed to be a good host under Greek law. And instead, he either, if they're too short, he stretches them onto his bed like it's a rack until they die, or if they're too tall, he cuts pieces off of them until they fit, until they die. And what the Greeks are saying is this is what the human mind does. We look at reality and we refuse to take it in its own terms. We insist on warping it and bending it until it fits our priorities and our preconceptions. And it stops being about what it's actually about, and it becomes about us and our world and what matters to us. It's a parochialism of the ego and a tendency to rewrite everything to fit the bed of our minds. And I think that's what people do. Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, there's an enormous body of literature from the 70s to the present that's all about interpreting Revelations as whatever the interpreter is concerned about.
Yes, and that's troublesome because they kind of sometimes pull the same analogies or similar analogies with the like the fall of the US or stuff like that, and then I've read more books about the fall of the US and rising and falls of great nations, and it's kind of just, it almost like reinforces that analogy that was given to me. I don't know what the answer is. I think for me, I may have to just pull it apart on my own, like the threads. There was a woman that was kindly sharing her experience of writing down her values. Like maybe I need to write the beasts as what they mean to me. Like what are my 8 beasts?
Yeah, right.
And make it an art project or something, eat some mushrooms and do that to deconstruct it. But it's a clump in my mind. Yeah. And I understand that I'm seeing the world, including my current perspective, my current narrow perspective of politics and theology and all these different things is seen through philosophy, is seen through this kind of knot of the book of Revelation, because it was, we studied it so much when I was growing up because my dad was into it and everything. So the other information that's out there, they don't help me deconstruct it very well, is giving me enough, like I need individual imagery and analogies like kind of pulled apart in my mind. And I really don't know how to do that. And I know that it's affecting my worldview in a way that it could be holding me back. And that's what I feel like the message of what he's trying to get us to do is, so that I was just reflecting on what are mine, like what are my threads that I need to pull apart. Yeah. I'm not at all, defending it or thinking it's true, but I know that I still feel them to be true. And that maybe a feeling like I want sugar, but it's not necessarily a good feeling. Yeah. But it's there,
The mind's drawn to its familiar knots and it goes back to them. But you start to liberate yourself when you start to trace the threads through those knots and figure out, where did they come from and what does this mean to me? And then you can make choices about it, which you can't do until you've done that analysis. Sharon, you want to come off mute?
I just wanted to address what Claire was saying. Can you hear
please. Me? Yeah.
Um, and I'd say a couple of general things. The
Please.
scriptural text is the one of the books that's the most widely interpreted, I think, of all books.
Mm-hmm.
And the interpretation that's given to a particular book, a particular passage, all depends on the perspective of the person delivering the dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is the construct of the Bible. When they're putting the books together, it was a political tool. It was a way to control the people. So the scary stuff, as you were saying, it's a surprise that the book of Revelation made it in, because that's a pretty scary book.
Yeah.
And the whole goal was to minimize controversy in inclusion of the books of the Bible. And there are many books that are left out. The book of Judas, the Gnostic Gospels, there are many, many books that are left out of the Bible.
Thomas.
Yes. And the third thing is the book of Revelation is the most fascinating book. It's fascinating that it was written while Paul was on the Isle of Patmos. And his state of mind, for me, and I came up as a pastor's daughter, and Revelation was always of interest. This was the thing that was terrorizing me, because this was going to be the end of the world.
Yeah.
But I encourage you to engage in doubt, because doubt is the way to certainty. And as you get older and you expose yourself to other philosophies and philosophers, you will come to a point that you will be able to live with, or you'll be able to understand. But questioning is always a very, very good thing. I personally think the book of Revelation is extremely, extremely metaphorical, and therefore it's open to many, many interpretations. How real it is, probably not very real.
I remember that during the late medieval era, the Catholic Church fought hard against having the Bible translated into English. And part of the reason for that is they said some of this you can read literally without any background and you can understand it. But some of this, if you take it literally, it will lead you to the wrong places. Because some of it's metaphorical. And some of it, for example, in the Old Testament, there's sections that the Jews understand as representing the law at different times for different people, not as an eternal law for all people for all time. And you have to read, the Torah carefully with that knowledge of history to understand what the law is today that we're supposed to follow. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live was a specific time and place. The Jews all know that, but the Catholic Church was worried, if you just translate this into English and anybody with no background and no understanding of history reads it, they're going to think, oh, God's telling me to find a witch and burn them. So they're like, let's just leave that in Latin, and we'll have the priests who've gone through the training and learned their history. They can be the ones to sort of carefully do that. It was after it was translated into English that the Inquisition just lit on fire and went all over the place. Everyone started to get really serious about, we have to follow all this stuff, and we have to critique the way that whether the church is doing all of the things that the Bible says, because the tendency to take it as the word of God literally is the obvious temptation, right? Here's God's book. He must mean every word of it literally at the same time. I can pick any part I want out of context and make it mean what I want it to mean. And somehow I won't be distorting it because it's God's word. It's a natural temptation. This goes back to Heraclitus, right? That it would not be better if we got what we wanted. So we got easy access to the words, but without the context and the interpretation that makes sense out of it. It became as much a hazard as a blessing. So it's if you look at Kenneth Smith's essay here, you can see that part of what he's doing is he's not trying to describe all the different things that Christianity has ever thought at one time or another, not all the elements of the catechism, not all of the variants. He's trying to get at what is the revolutionary core of Christianity that distinguishes it from the ancient epoch and from the modern epoch. And he hits on this notion of the relationship between grace and spirit as being really distinctive to Christianity. The ancient Greeks would never have seen the world in those terms. And we don't see the world. The modern era doesn't see the world in those terms. It's a distinctively medieval idea that grace is a little kindling or reflection of God within us. And it's a gift. You can't deserve it. God gave it to you, right? Whether you deserve it or not. And that you have to be searching for the meaning of it and to try to be worthy of it. Not so that God will give you more, because it's not up to you what God gives you, but because he's God, because he's supposed to be the source of meaning and goodness and direction, the incorruptible source, right? As opposed to Rome. This essay was the first time I understood why Augustine called his book The City of God. There's a reference in here Kenneth Smith makes to the city of man, right? That to the early Christians, man was corruptible. They looked at Rome and they looked at this succession of just dreadful emperors, and not just the emperors, but the governors and the people who were appointed, who were supposed to have the public trust, but who were instead lining their own pockets and raiding the public and abusing everything. And they said, this is terrible. This level of corruption is intolerable, and how are we possibly going to escape it? Right? So for them, it was about overcoming corruption. It was about trying to find the good, pure thing, and to organize all of life around that pure, good thing. Very different. Go ahead, Jody.
So I didn't get a chance to read the whole article, and looks like the last 5 pages didn't print. But just the beginning of it, when he talks about grace, is so beautiful. Like his concept of, I had never thought of grace as such a Christian value. And, it was always Adam and Eve and the rib thing. Sorry, I know.
No, I like that. Adam and Eve and the rib thing is great.
Yeah. But the way that he, puts the context of grace, and then grace is the ultimate confidence that even at its most taxing or horrendous or despairing, life deserves from us a response of profound thanksgiving.
Yes.
Oh my God. I was like, okay,
yes,
that's going to be my Thanksgiving blurb during Thanksgiving dinner. It's just that concept is so beautiful.
Right? It's powerful, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You can feel it, even from a modernist perspective. You can feel the pull of the idea that we don't deserve life. We're lucky to be. And, sure, we don't like the bad things that happen, but what about the good things that happen, right? None of that would have happened if it weren't for the good fortune that's landed in our laps. And we need to recognize that we're dependent upon some larger picture that's even made us possible at all. It's like one of the possible responses to the modernist ego is, well, you didn't make yourself, did you? Where did you come from?
I also loved that he was able to find a link, or to explore the link between grace, as in it's being intuition, and that's a very feminine concept and has been pushed aside. And then also faith, what is faith? And there's one line that says, faith is the immediate fruit of grace, and the organ also by which grace is most profoundly perceived. Faith should truly be in no way tender-minded about itself, or shameful, or timid of how it may appear in the eyes of the world.
Yes.
Grounded in grace, it is the profoundest and vigorous form of self-confidence, of aptness of life, the radiant and naked certainty of the evidence of things not seen. And I was just blown away that is what he made of the stories of Christianity.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's very reminiscent of Hindu philosophy.
Right.
However, it brings so much more together than anything I had ever imagined was, in Christian faith.
Right.
So, and, linking And then it's also grace is the presence of a kind of nourishing maternal love for created spirits. So he's embracing the feminine side of, and grace is always viewed, you know, when you say the word she has grace, it's always she, it's not he has grace.
Yeah.
It's always the way that she moves, she has grace. And the way, you know, and it's something that is just intuitive. You have it or you don't have it. It's not something you can learn. So that whole concept was mind-blowing to me and so beautiful and touching.
Thank you, Jody. Dave, I'm going to call on you in a second. I just want to add one thing to what Jody said to help frame it, which is, you know, the reason that this is so potent is because what Kenneth Smith's thing that he does is he tries to do real justice to other perspectives, to not just make them caricatures in terms of his worldview or our worldview, but to say in their own terms, what is their meaning? And what we find is that, you know, the most original thinkers, they really do make sense within their own terms, and they've got something to say, but you have to be able to get out of our own perspective in order to hear it correctly. And so what you're reading here is Kenneth's distillation of, you know, Jesus and Paul and Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Hildegard von Bingen. You know, he's going to the source of serious Christian mystics of the medieval era, rather than going to say Bertrand Russell and saying, well, what does modernist Bertrand Russell think about Christianity in the Middle Ages, right? Which is what most atheists do, for example, is they want a warpage, they want a caricature so that they can, you know, beat the dead horse in their minds. He's saying, no, but what did Hildegard von Bingen think? I mean, why did she see visions of God? Why did it move her the way that it did? And then just tries to, in the clearest possible way, translate that for us, so that just for a moment, we can catch the scent of what it really meant to a medieval Christian to be so committed to grace and spirit and to that worldview. So this is his job here is not so much, you know, portraying his perspective on what grace objectively is, but to be a midwife, to give birth for us a perspective that otherwise we didn't have access to, that was there all along in our past, lost to us. Go ahead, Dave.
I really read the essay much in the same way, and maybe even further, that he's elevating these concepts, the concept of grace and the concept of fate, as the way that these people derived meaning during those periods of time. This gave their life actual meaning. If you existed in the Christian period, the concept of grace and these concepts of faith that he writes so beautifully and eloquently about were what gave your life meaning. And then he shows that progression, meaning, and following that in the Greek and the Hellenic period was really about fate and the card you were dealt with, and overcoming that through the virtues and the morality that those cultures tried to pass down through their great plays. And I think that's what makes this such a potent critique of popular culture, because you go from these high-minded concepts of grace and fate, the two key variables that gave people meaning, and then in the modern era, there is nothing to replace that. And so I'm reading his essay as him saying, we've dropped the ball. We need to put something in place here. And I think the final word that the final sentence of the essay really puts punctuation on it, in that he says, to live on but have no value except as a pathetic egocentrist or moral opportunist. What is the merit in that? Is him basically saying, hey, we've gone from putting all of our stock into the grace of God, and then evolving into, hey, how can we overcome the hand that we were dealt through the positive values and virtues of being humanity? And now we're in a point where we've sort of reverted to just being a pathetic egocentrist. And this is not the way. And leaving you on that note that, hey, you've got anything but this, anything but this. Here are two ways that worked in the past, and they're so powerful because this is what gave people's lives meaning. Where are you going to find your meaning? It can't be in just being an egocentrist. I thought it was really a brilliant essay.
Yeah. I'm with you. I love the way that it ends, and of course his reference to pathetic is that he's using it as the technical term for pathos, and what he's alluding to is the way that in the medieval era they thought that by overthrowing nature and putting God ahead of nature, they were liberating themselves from the limitations of nature, including its corrupting influences. And in the same way, the modernist revolution, by overthrowing God, thought that we were now going to be completely free and we could do whatever we wanted. We'd be free to choose and make a better world. And what he's saying is, but the Greeks already called this. They already said that we have an internal nature. We have our own character that's part of us. And instead of being free, what we're doing is making ourselves slaves of that nature while denying that we're slaves of it. We imagine that we're free now that we're slaves to our egos and our stomachs, but we're less free than we ever were. Because whether it's God or whether it's nature or whether it's one of who knows how many thousands of other potent worldviews have existed on this planet over the hundreds of thousands of years that human beings have been a species, those all offer a way out of the trap of being controlled by your own ego. And modernism has turned its back on all of those possibilities and therefore left us stuck in the labyrinth. And if we want a better world, step one is to recognize that we're in the labyrinth and then to do something about it, to find more sources of meaning and to struggle for them.
Yeah, and to be comfortable making a value judgment that certain ways of thinking are better or worse than others. I think that's a key variable that he
Yes.
mentions in this essay, and that is so uncomfortable for us in our modern time when we're trying to be so sensitive to everyone's point of view. I think Ken Smith would really say, hey, wait a minute, are you sure you want to live in a world where everyone's point of view is equal? I think he would say no, that there some points of view are better and worse than others. And to be comfortable with that is the only way you could have a compass or a North Star to start to create meaning in your own life. And that's what I think these previous cultures did intuitively, either through the grace of God or through overcoming the fate in their culture. And that's what we need to do as well.
Right. Hang on a sec. I got to step away for a moment. I'll be right back. Carry on without me for a minute.
Okay, chat people, speak up. You're having your own conversation back there. We can't follow both.
Well, if anybody hasn't read the essay, I certainly encourage everybody to on your own read it. In fact, there's so much here we could probably do another day.
Oh yeah,
we probably could.
Yeah, it's so dense and beautiful.
So, as to what Dave just said about the essay and the meaning of it, I wanted to call people's attention to a really quite a good book by Gilbert Murray. It's called 5 Stages of Greek Religion. It's a very academic title. It's not the kind of title that would draw most people to want to read it, but it is a beauty. It's a little paperback, and he basically describes the rise and fall of the classical Greek worldview in their own terms, based on their documentation of what they did. And the 5th chapter, which I think is titled The Loss of Nerve, describes how they gave up polytheism and embraced Christianity. And it gives you maybe a quarter of what Ken is talking about here, about how Christianity was a revolution against the ancient world order and why and what happened. And one of the things, Murray doesn't try to do a whole picture of that revolution the way that Kenneth Smith sort of alludes to here in this essay. But he does talk about an element of it, which is that the Greeks were so frustrated. They were just so disappointed and frustrated. Their civilization it was going back down the same path. They were self-destroying, just like the Mycenaeans had done. I don't know how many of you have read Thucydides, The Peloponnesian War. If you haven't, oh my God, what a great book. It's Thucydides is widely seen as, if I could spell here, Peloponnesian War. He's widely seen as one of the first serious historians in Europe, because it was important to him to try to capture events as they actually happened and not as he wanted them to happen. And he says that in his introduction, which sets him apart from Herodotus, who came before. Herodotus passed on whatever was charming or interesting or whatever, regardless of whether it was true or not. And what Thucydides did is he took what he thought happened and then he went and interviewed people who were actually there at the events in the war so that he could find out what they said happened and not what he wanted to have happened. It's fascinating. And part of what he's talking about in the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides is talking about the way that the Greeks, after this enormous high of defeating the Persian Empire, tiny Greece fights back the massive Persian Empire and wins. It's like, wow, who could have foreseen that? This seemed to be saying that the Greek approach was a winner, that it was going to be a viable culture, that they had undone the Dark Age, they had created a new classical era, and they could go on, and they could avoid destroying themselves the way that the Mycenaeans did. But what Thucydides is saying in the Peloponnesian War, which is very hard for a modern to understand who doesn't know this background about the Greeks, is, oh, sweet Jesus, we're doing it again. It's like the subtext of the Peloponnesian War is, this is what we said we would never do. Right here, Athens versus Sparta, right? We just fought off the greatest empire in the world, and now we're turning on each other. We can't seem to stop fighting. And the whole thing reads like a historical tragedy from that perspective. If you read all the speeches and all the battles from the perspective of what we hoped we would do and what we're doing instead, it's this gigantic tragedy. And what makes it worse is, after the Peloponnesian War, after Sparta and Athens fought, and Sparta overthrew Athens and became the leading power, well, Thebes and Corinth and all of the city-states started fighting against each other and overthrowing each other one after another. There was a whole succession of civil wars and collapses. By the time Alexander the Great defeated the Greeks, it was easy. They were just exhausted and weakened and demoralized. They'd lost their spirit as a culture. They no longer believed in the project that the Olympians had set up for them at the end of the Dark Age. You know, to anthropoculture and paideia, they'd given up. They'd lost their nerve, in the words of Gilbert Murray. They were ripe for a new way of looking at the world. So when Christianity came and said, you know, we read Jesus as casting out demons, but if you were a Greek, that's not what you would have read. You would have read that he was casting out daemons, because the Greeks thought your character was your divinity, your subtle divinity that rode your back and guided your actions, that you didn't really have free will. You're subject to your daemon. Your daemon is your character. And if you don't cultivate your character, then it's just luck of the draw, however you happen to have been born, whatever you ended up with. But if you do cultivate your character, like Claire's talking about, if you trace through the threads of your ideas and the things that have influenced you and try to figure them out and untangle them and become a participant in shaping your character, then you could create some free will. This was the Greek model of how this worked. But by the time the Greeks had just trashed their civilization with civil war after civil war after civil war, they had given up. They're like, this is just not working. So Christianity comes along and says, you know what? You don't have to be subject to nature. You could put your affairs in the hands of someone perfect, someone who's genuinely good and not corruptible, and just he'll tell you what to do. You don't have to be worrying about whether you're secretly, you're trying to do the good thing, you think, but actually you're trying to benefit yourself. It's like, and cut through all of that nonsense and just let God tell you what the right thing is to do. So Greece embraced Christianity early on, as we know from the Gospels, partly because of what Gilbert Murray's writing about in 5 Stages of Greek Religion. Because as an epoch, they become exhausted. They were just... And they'd been conquered. At this point, they'd been conquered by the Macedonians, who then in turn were conquered by the Romans. So it's just a whole series of collapses. They'd fallen down a long staircase from the early days of self-determination, and we're going to rise up from a dark age. They were like lying at the landing at the bottom of the basement, looking up, going, "How did this even happen?" You know what we need? We need a savior. At this point, I'm looking for a savior, right? So So there's a reason why they then pounced on these ideas of grace and spirit and trying to create something that would last longer than a human lifetime or even what they could now see as a single civilization's lifetime. Could we make something that endured more than that and was better than that? And right or wrong, in any particular detail, the thing that we can see in common here between the medieval epoch and the ancient epoch is that they were both reactions against how bad things could get. And both of them were trying to say, whatever our prescription, that arrow pointing up from the worst that we can be is the most important thing. Whether it points to nature, whether it points to God, whether it points to some other thing out of the hundreds of possible worldviews that have maybe existed in the hundreds of thousands of years people have been around, whatever it points to, it's like Dave said, it's got to be better than this, because ego deified and run rampant over the world, as Augustine is alluding to in his work, The City of God, is just, it's the worst. You just can't live in a world full of Trumps and Caligulas and Hitlers. It's just, that's intolerable. We need a better answer than that.
So it almost kind of reminds me of like a sort of a Christian Trinity thing, in the sense that like we start, so of course we're talking about the Western canon, right? We're not really bridging out into the rest of the world, which would be in this case the majority of the world, but we're starting with nature from the ancients, and then we go into God and grace from the medievals, and then we sort of end up with this individual ego from us moderns. And I'm wondering if it's almost like a triangle on a spinning wheel. We're already starting to see more and more like back to nature ideas or back to nature movements, and like, is the next epoch just going to be a sort of a return to the Greek idea, and then we have to go through the same process again? Or is there a way to sort of synthesize these three? In a sense, you could almost say the ego and the individuals is the attempt to synthesize, right, the embodiment of God, or the deification of the individual man, and then the embodiment of nature, like nature is man and man is nature, in which we're trying to create this sort of like almost Ubermensch, I guess. I don't really want to use that word in that phrase. I know I'm misusing it, but like the idea of modern man being the collision of both, and also to seeing this as a continuing process, right? We're just, as we're sort of taking out the trash, we're starting to see like the flowers sprouting from underneath, and sort of what comes next. It's going to be a, I don't know. And then I also tend to think that the human species is inherently flawed in the sense that we're always going to try to create these grand ideas and sort of grand means of understanding our own position, but the processes of our social development is always going to cause us to crash and burn, like the Greeks or like the medievals, or like sort of what contemporary society seem to be doing today. So in that way, it does turn or what Kenneth Smith, or I should probably ask it, what Kenneth Smith is saying, is it very much so an individual process? In which case we should sort of look at society and say it's going to continue to fall. Almost a Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think that's Mark Twain. It's just going to continue to rhyme, and we can't really do anything, even if we do happen to be Aristoi, but sort of sit up and try to create high culture. And does high culture, is there a constant sort of stream of societies persecuting people who try to explain or try to step outside of the box and sort of take these perspective shifts? Like, it seems like history it tells us that these people are always pushed outside as pariahs or outcasts, or either made like, or in that sense. I don't know. There's a couple of things that I just unloaded. I hope it's not too much.
It's great stuff, man. And there's a lot of things that arise out of that. One of them is, Kenneth Smith. I can't say Kenneth Smith is a Hegelian, because he being anything would make it an ideology. And if Kenneth Smith is anything, he's anti-ideology. So his whole thing is polyperspective, approaches. But Hegel and Marx certainly were influences on Kenneth, and they both have a model of history in which instead of going in a circle, it goes in a helix. It's, you come back around, but you're now at a different level. You don't actually repeat. You return to having some things in common with an earlier era, but other things are so different that you couldn't call it the same era. It's now, it's moved on. And part of the reason is that we've changed, the world has changed, our ecosystems have changed, the conditions that existed then, what we were like, what we knew and didn't know, and what the world was like and what it could sustain, they aren't the same anymore. And so if we ever come back around to Greek naturalism, it won't be Greek naturalism. It'll be some new kind of naturalism plus, naturalism kind of something added to.
Would
Nietzsche
that be
was
sort of a, oh,
ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, would that be sort of like a transubstantiation idea? Like the faculties stay the same, but it looks different. So like in a sense, what we would come around to, like we're still in grace. Theoretically, we haven't fallen from the graces of heaven, or like we're still in sort of that womb of the earth that Kenneth Smith described, and thereby we're still in nature, and we're still already in these things. We've just changed the definitions of them. And I think one of the things, or perhaps the question to the group is like how do we obtain again that sort of the ability to define that we're actually a part of these things. Like it seems like we're trying to tell the world that we are a part of these things, but because our definitions are so skewed, maybe it's because the powers that be, we lack the ability. Like saying grace now, it immediately brings an institutionalized Christian notion of like, get your grace or else you won't get into heaven, or saying
Right.
nature now sort of just brings this sort of capitalist Western idea of something to exploit. But like the ideas are still there. They're just hidden by propaganda purposes. I don't know. It's another question that sort of goes nowhere.
Well, no, it does take us in a direction. It's like, so we can ask questions about why is there this semi-repetition in history? And Kenneth would say that it's because we keep treating as an external problem something that is an internal struggle. The tendency of human beings to slip into the dualic or banausic or eristic modes of thought is not arbitrary. It's not just something that happened to have happened. It's not something imposed like a design upon us. It's that these are natural responses to stress, right? One natural response to stress is to just react to it emotionally through our drives, through our impulses, through our intuition. Another reaction is to try to escape it and look at it from the outside abstractively. These are just natural things for us. And designing a civilization around one or the other impulse being dominant, being the primary source of truth, is again just a very natural thing for us to do. And it means there's going to tend to be an oscillation between those modes, between a don't think too much, just do what you feel mode, and a don't feel too much because feelings are scary, just think all the time and make systems mode. These are natural things to get stuck in. But the problem is the world is a real thing. It's not just a reflection of our minds. And as we act out as Romans, or as the medieval Holy Roman Empire, or now as the Pax Americana, as we act out, we change the world. We change the conditions. The early pioneers and the Native Americans they met said that there were once you could see flocks of birds cover the sky from horizon to horizon for days as they migrated. Like you woke up the next day and they were still migrating. The flock was that big. They said you could look out across a river and it was so teeming with fish, their backs breaking the water all the way from side to side, that you would think that you could walk across their backs to the other side. Now, what do we say? These are tall tales, right? It was never like that. Why do we say that? Because that's not what we see now. And trapped within our eternal present, we assume that things have always been as impoverished as they are now. If you're trying to force people to pay you money to get food, the first thing you have to do is use up the food supplies. Because if there's food all around them, they don't have to come to you and give you money. They don't have to work for you. Same for trees. If there's trees everywhere and you want to make money off of trees, you've got to cut most of them down. You've got to go through them and then put a wall around the trees that are left and say, this is my private property, keep off. Oh, you want a board? You want to make a house? Pay me some money. You can't actually get into this stage of capitalism we're in until after you kind of exploit on a massive scale the natural resources that are there and reduce the carrying capacity of the planet to something small enough that you can now bully people over access to it. So as an example, the story about the fish seeming to be that you could walk across their backs, we actually know that's true. The Columbia River was originally named what would, in our language, we would call the Oregon River. And the word Oregon comes from ulachan, which is a Native American word for the candlefish, the smelt. And they, like salmon, they do migrate at certain times. And we do have clear records that there used to be such enormous smelt runs that you could see them. You could see their backs across the entire Columbia River from one side to the other. That's how it was. And that's why in the Pacific Northwest, contrary to what anthropologists have always thought was a rule for civilization, the Native Americans who lived up here were able to establish a high level of culture with philosophy and sophisticated art and complex societies without any agriculture. Without any agriculture, because there was so much food. Food was everywhere. Wood was everywhere. This was just like a bounty. Well, it's not now, because what did we do with it? We crashed it, right? We exploited it. We related to it in a non-regenerative way until we used it up to the point that then people couldn't just go out and catch their own fish whenever they wanted to because there weren't that many fish. So what's happening is modernism has changed the world to a state that you couldn't go back to the way of life that you had before because the resources aren't there anymore. If we wanted to get back to an earlier state, we'd have to go through an intermediate state that was regenerative, in which our relationship to the ecosystem was to build it back up, to get to the point where we could live the way that we did before. And if we don't do that, then it's just simply impossible to live the way that we used to live. So this is why it can't be a circle. We changed the world as we went around, and now we're in a different place. The world is in a different place.
May I say something?
Please, Jyoti.
So I lived in the Northwest for over a decade.
I'm in Seattle.
In Portland, so closer to the Columbia River. And my son loves to fish, and we love to hike, and the beauty of it is amazing, and the fertility of the Columbia River Valley is amazing. But I wanted to come to like a little step above, which is that like one of the things that I struggle with is population. Like for us to sustain the amount of people that are on the earth now, we have to use certain means that, not everybody can live on organic food or biodynamic food. And who are we to say to set the priorities for people that don't have things? Like, in my anthropology class, we in uni we were talking about like cell phones or something like that. I forget what particular instrument it was, and we were like, oh my gosh, that's going to ruin the integrity of the Sri Lankan culture. However, who are we to, in our society here, where we're reaping the benefits or the unbenefits of having a cell phone, to tell people that don't have one to, hey, this is not what is in your best interest? Or, are we? How do we know it's not in their best interest? We assume that because, hey, we have a proliferation of cars. You take example of cars, and there's, traffic everywhere. But all of a sudden, people can move in India where they couldn't before. They can communicate with their family, which they couldn't before. I can talk to my aunt in rural India. She lives in a mud home, cooks on a little stove that's powered by cow dung cakes. But I can call her because she has a phone and talk to her, and like she's so just have that relationship. It's such a beautiful capacity. So I think we're speaking a lot from a privileged point of view. So
that's an easy trap to fall into for sure. You know, it's why kind of there are limits to our ability to think our way to the solution. You know, we part of it is the experience of life and the practice of life and finding out what works and what doesn't work. An example of that is the idea of hydroelectric dams. In the Pacific Northwest, an enormous amount of our power comes from hydroelectric dams, which we always touted as clean power. Because get us, we're not polluting the air with coal dust. We don't have nuclear meltdowns or nuclear waste to get rid of. The list goes on. But it turns out that the price of those dams was to kill the salmon runs in all these rivers. And, you know, modern economists can now put a price on how much was all that salmon worth that used to swim up these rivers every year that now we don't have. What's the going price of salmon today now that it's scarcer and scarcer, and all the people who can't eat salmon because it's not available anymore. And as we are developing newer tech in solar and wind and other things, we're discovering that we could generate that electricity a whole lot more cheaply without trashing the river. So there's this movement spreading across the Pacific Northwest to find old dams that really were never generating much for us by comparison, and pull them out so that the salmon runs can regenerate and we can get back the salmon that we lost. So there was a trade-off. We talked about the dams as though they were just a 100% pure, clean bargain, right? This is progress because it's clean energy. But it turns out it wasn't all that clean. It came at the cost of mass extinction, which we forgot to factor in until we noticed. So this is what I mean about, you know, if we ask an epoch or a civilization in its own terms, what its bargains are and how it's working, what it's prioritizing, it can't actually explain them very clearly. It can only explain what it's aware of. It can't explain its blind spots, its nescience. What's the word I'm looking? It's lacunae. The gaps in the text. I see. Dana, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Tentatively, yeah.
Go ahead.
So I traveled the United States, state to state, and I would enjoy doing this camping cross country. And each place had its own unique culture, its own vernacular, you know, its own idea of what swear words were. Right. There's still there's still dialect, right? There's still accent and everything. I grew up in the Southern Midwest, so I can fall into it very quickly.
Sure.
But then came Walmart.
Yes.
And I traveled with my daughter to give her this rich experience. Everyone was dressed the same.
Yes.
Everyone was listening to the same music.
Right.
Everyone was, so we took and homogenized all these rich cultures. And I think those of us who know that this has happened here through incorporation, because really, you know, the UN is like meh, but you get to the whatchamacallits that are the mega corporations that are meeting, who have their own militias and armies, right? Then you're talking real power. And so they decided, you know, it would be really cool, you know, cars and this and this and this. And so there's some little cultural differences, like extra prejudice and those kind of things that still linger. And then when Clinton's administration dropped regulation of the FCC, we had, you know, neither side's pure, right? Then we had things like Clear Channel buying all the radio stations and all the local media. Right. So they were only getting right wing, and still are, information and jokes. They don't ever hear it from another side. And so that's about the only, so then the only thing you really get to experience right now in the US when you're traveling is the divides. Is this, like you said in the beginning about, you know, creating our own warfare within And is
Right.
it the individual fighting with themselves, projecting it? Is it, yeah. So where's that all coming from? And, but I think we look at the world and we see the rainforest burning down. And we think of the original Oregon forests that are gone. True old woods, like John Wayne standing in front of a tree that's the size of a mansion across or more. And and we're panic stricken because we want a place to visit. Really deep down, we want a place that still has culture, that doesn't look like Walmart. But the truth is, I went and spent a month in Nepal, and the women still have to wear, for the most part, the original traditional garb, but the men are wearing Western clothes and not wearing their traditional garments. And so, and that's going to continue until the women aren't either. And then, so we're like an infection. Our capitalism is like an infection. So then I think we do sit down in panic looking at these other places and go, I don't know about cell phones, but but if you burn down the rainforest, and we come up with other stuff like that's the lungs. I'm like, well, they're like, no, and well, yeah, it part of the lungs is to the CO2, right? So it's not just how much oxygen's in the air. It's
yes,
two things are supposed to happen, guys.
Yes.
But anyway, I just that came to my mind of watching this happen to the U.S. over a short period of time. Don't step on him. You okay? Sorry, I'll mute. I've got a sick one, and
yeah, my grandfather grew up in the redwood forests. He was part of an extended logging family, and he didn't like how parochial it was, so he went away to college and became a Navy man and saw the world. But he used to tell me that people born in the 50s and 60s and 70s and later simply can't imagine how many trees there used to be. You just literally cannot imagine it. And he didn't mean that figuratively. He meant our notion of what the world looks like was based on what we saw when we were kids growing up. And by then, he said enormous tracts of things were just gone forever. They'd been taken out. And so what happened is we got this diminishing sense of expectations. Each generation was willing to settle for sort of less diversity, less health, less life, fewer choices, less freedom, because that was all they ever knew. When we talk about the frog in the pot syndrome, that if you turn the temperature up immediately, a frog will leave, but if you turn it up gradually, it won't leave. It just thinks it's a little warmer and then a little warmer. There's a couple funny things about that. One is that frogs, in fact, don't do that. Frogs jump out of the pot when it gets too warm. It's only people that do that. Only of all the animals, it's only people that can be fooled into thinking that unhealthy things are normal and thinking, I'll just adapt to this. Any other animal has some point at which they're like, their instincts kick in, and they're like, the reason I exist as a species, says my cat who's sleeping here, is because millions of years of evolution have steered me away from stupid behavior. So if it gets too warm, I'm out of here, right? That's what the cat says. But our great evolutionary breakthrough that's made our minds possible, our capacity to abstract ourselves from our feelings and to inhabit that abstract world of ideas and reasoning, means that we can also be less in touch with our needs and what's actually important or healthy, and we can make bad choices. And so that's how generation by generation you can ratchet the expectations of a civilization downward, because the new generation never saw what the old generation lost, and so they thought it was never there. Jyoti, go ahead.
I just want to say that there's a lot of privilege in our conversation right now, that we are kind of losing track of what exactly happened since the 70s, 80s, and 60s, because there was a lot, like what Monsanto did in India to support the population growth in the Western world was horrendous. And, you know, they patented the seeds of farmers and then asked them to pay for those. And these were the seeds that had been used for centuries. So I have more faith in humankind, that we go through cycles. And you know, I always say to my children that, yeah, this is a problem that, you know, our generation created, but it's also something for you to ponder about, and there will be more that you can do about it.
That's right.
And so just one example, we went a couple of summers ago to Sandpoint in Idaho. It's a small little town. A lot of people from Portland are moving there because they're just done with the overdevelopment in Portland. So my friend sold her 1 acre plot and bought 30 acres in Sandpoint. So I'm going to Idaho and I'm going like, oh shoot, it's going to be Hickville. And, you know, am I going to be discriminated against and all that stuff, you know, prejudice. I land there and I see a beautiful community of artists. And these artists are Caucasian artists that are learning from Native American artists, you know, because the Native American next generation is not interested because they want to be successful in quote unquote our world and, you know, leave the reservations. But there's so much art that only is part of their generation, their generational, you know, passed on from generations. And all of a sudden, here you have a whole community of Caucasian artists that are learning from Native Americans. So the lineage does not get broken. I was just blown away by that we do find ways to incorporate and sustain the positive, you know, sustain the beauty in our world as a species. There's lots that has been lost, but there's lots that has been gained. I mean, when you think about the pandemic right now, if it had happened 100 years ago, who knows how many millions of people would have died. But yeah, we do have resources now that weren't there 100 years ago, and they have come at a cost. Walmart has come at a huge cost. Oh my gosh, I went to Walmart. I do not go to such stores. However, I had to go to Walmart to buy a bicycle for my daughter in Sandpoint. And I didn't know the logo. So there was a woman standing next to me and I was like, who works here for Walmart? And she's like, I'm wearing the West, for God's sake. I'm like, okay, sorry. But it has become very homogenized. However, you also have, you know, I went to a bakery here in Austin that's built in a small little house that's run by a Portuguese, Brazilian, and Illinois, and a person from Illinois. They make the most beautiful food and desserts and coffee. And who would have thought that those people, you know, persons from such different places had the opportunity to come together and make this place that's so beautiful. That's also a part of globalization, or a part of our ability to communicate and fly and, you know, become part of people that we normally would not even interact with, you know. So I I just want to add that extra dimension to our
Appreciate it.
discussion.
Thank you, Jody. I'm going to call on Sharon and then Claire.
One of my, the best part of this essay for me, and I haven't finished it yet, was Amythia in Modern Culture. And I want to follow up on something that Jody said. The first few paragraphs that I read talks about our ego, and I interpreted that to mean our insularity. And that impacts the way we think, that impacts the way we structure our society, and helps the culture in which we participate. And I've listened to, I think she's gone away now, said she took a trip and she went from town to town in America, and she saw the differences in culture, the way different people live. And I think it would alter our perspective as a culture a lot if we were exposed to other civilization. And I do think that travel is the ultimate political act.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is, and I don't mean politics of the infighting of the kind we have now. I mean politics of awareness.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it would really alter our perspectives, and the position we are now in the culture now. I think that's one of the big issues. It's education, and that education has a lot of parameters going into it, which are not enhancing.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, Diogenes would agree with you completely, right? That was his big thing is cosmopolitanism. Diogenes of Sinope. And his argument was that it's not possible to be philosophical or wise or even really good until you begin to understand the diversity of perspectives that are out there. You start to hear other people have things they care about. Other people have art and food different from yours, that there's different ways we could live. And it's only once you're aware of that diversity that you can start to make real choices. Before that, we're living inside our own little parochial world, and we think that we're choosing, but we're choosing from a menu of one item, which is the way things have always been done. It's not until the menu expands because of travel, because of the good globalization that Jody talks about, where people are exposed to new ideas, then they can start to make choices. I think you're right, Sharon. Claire?
Thank you for converting it to philosophy. Diogenes and syncope, you said, right?
Oh, I'll put him in the chat here. Diogenes and Sinope. Claire, you want to go ahead?
I'm gonna have to hammer you,
please,
Rick, about the getting that seminar off of that hard drive.
Yes. Right. Well, we never got to Diogenes. The seminar didn't go that far. We were still in the pre-Socratics.
Well, maybe we can finish that. But I want those one of these days.
Yeah, I'd like to get Kenneth to pick that up again and take us through Plato and Aristotle and Diogenes.
Yeah, we got to get to it. We got to.
Yeah.
Well, I know nothing about it. It's just fascinating. It is.
He was a cynic, not of the modern sense of the word, but the old sense of the word, like a dog. He wanted us to get more in touch with the natural human beings that we could have been if we didn't live such artificial lives, so distanced from the world and from reality. And he was also a major cosmopolitanist who thought that any culture that thinks it's the best culture is probably nothing of the sort, because it's going to turn inward and obsess over itself, when it should turn outward and learn more and grow more and talk more.
Yes.
Diogenes famously chewed out Alexander the Great. For example, Alexander the Great, who everybody was worshiping as almost a god, and he heard of this great philosopher Diogenes, and he traveled to meet him. And Diogenes had given away all his stuff. Like before Jesus, Diogenes had the same idea that the material possessions are a distraction, and they massage the ego. And what we ought to do is give our stuff away and be kind to other people and try to be good people. So he lived in an empty wine barrel, and just sort of wandered around the city, finding food wherever he could find it and striking up conversations with whoever he could. And here comes Alexander the Great to meet him. And so there's Diogenes Diogenes in his barrel lying on its side. And here comes Alexander the Great saying, so you're the great philosopher Diogenes. I'm so delighted to meet you. I've conquered the known world, and I have more money than anybody's ever had before. And I have contacts across, from here to India. Is there anything I can do for you? And Diogenes says, well, you're standing in my sunlight, so if you could step a little to the side, I think I'd be happy. That's pretty much all I want from you and your money and power. This is Diogenes. He was a joker.
Okay.
So,
remember Paul Allswang?
Sorry, go ahead, David.
You remember Paul Allswang?
Yes.
Paul Allswang, Dreams of a Dog.
Yes.
I have that somewhere. I was planning on doing that for our comics reading group.
Nice.
Yeah.
I guess I have to share the most famous Diogenes story. If we're going to talk about Diogenes, I'm ashamed I didn't say it first. A lot of people criticized Plato as not really a philosopher at the time. And later he became seen as the philosopher. But at the time, a lot of other Greek philosophers were like, this guy's a poet who wants to be a philosopher. He's a poet who loved Socrates, who was a philosopher, and is angry at everybody for killing Socrates. And so now he's going to try to promulgate his own philosophy. But if you look at it, it's too much like an ideology. It's like the Republic is a blueprint for fascism and totalitarianism more than it is a philosophical thing. So, that a lot of people like to poke fun at Plato for being too that. And so Plato was giving his definitions of things, and he said, well, man is a featherless biped, right? He's trying to come up with these short, succinct summations of all things. And he says, that's how you know what man is. Man is a featherless biped. And Aristotle and others thought, dear God, this is such a glancing, aspectival, irrelevant characterization of what makes human beings what they are. So Diogenes famously plucked a chicken and threw it on the table in front of Plato and said, there's your man. And famously, after that, Plato revised his definition to say, man is a featherless biped having broad, flat nails. In other words, he totally didn't get the point at all what Diogenes was saying, which is you're being trapped by your ideas, man. You got to get to the essence of what people are. You can't just pick some characteristics. So Diogenes, joker. All we have left fragments, no full book.
If we want to trace back, where did mankind go wrong? Probably when we selected Plato as our starting point for intellectual activity.
One of the things Kenneth Smith talks about that's interesting about the birth of Christianity is that early Christianity was originally not going to go with Plato. Some of the early Christians were trying to make a Christianity based on Heraclitus. And for a while, there were Christian sects that were preserving Heraclitus's texts. And to this day, we don't have a single book of Heraclitus's. We just have fragments. But we wouldn't even have that much, except that when the dominant form of Christianity rose later and decided to embrace Plato as being more amenable to their view of how heaven relates to the world, they had to refute all of the splinter groups that were still interested in Heraclitus. And so there are some great works of heresy refutation. One of them is called Against All Heresies, in fact, that quote Heraclitus at great length in order to show why he's stupid and he's bad and nobody should believe him. And you should all believe Plato instead. And if that guy hadn't spent so much time trying to disprove Heraclitus because the early Christians had adopted him, we would have lost almost all of Heraclitus. Over half of the Heraclitus we have is from that attempt to refute him because the early Christians liked him. So the vicissitudes of history. Is that not crazy? So Mark, you have a question.
Yes, and a comment. And this essay reminded me a great deal of the Republic, or at least the allegory of the page. And there's all of history, from Whitehead is footnotes on Plato. So
right.
How would you read the Republic? But there's a cost to freedom.
Yes.
Real freedom is going to be able to follow what your values are and being kind of and not free. Whereas actual freedom is chaos and slavery. And so the essay is about, what are you willing to pay for freedom?
That's a major point. That's right.
And Plato is very interesting. There's a lot of ways to read it, and
Yeah, that's right.
it's just about the soul, and also he looks at that big number 3 that comes up, all 3 times in this essay, 3 parts in kind of Smith's cosmology of psychic types.
So you know why the 3? I was going to mention that earlier, and I forgot. I put it in the chat. There's a reason why 3 comes up over and over. It's because of dialectics.
Sure.
Because of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. In order to understand something in context and figure out how the struggle of them can resolve in some new thing, you end up with 3 over and over. So 3 character types, 3 epochs in history, etc. But what's interesting about what Kenneth Smith says in this essay is what he doesn't say, which is he's only describing these 3 epochs because we have them well documented. But of course, how many were there before? And meanwhile, while that's going on in Europe, what was happening in Asia? What was happening in Africa? What was happening in the Americas, in Australia? So the 3 is he's choosing it here as a way to set up a dialectical relationship to show you the struggle between these different epochs and their worldviews. But as Hegel said, what happens after synthesis is that your synthesis becomes a new thesis and a new antithesis develops against it. And so that's why history keeps moving, is there's no end point. What we think of as an end point becomes the new starting point. And it's also why history doesn't move in a circle, because the original thesis, antithesis, synthesis that caused the first spinning back around also moved us up a level. We now can't go back to where we were because we understand or have experienced or have unleashed the changes caused by the original struggle between the 2 opposing factions. And now the world's changed, and so are we.
And truth is always there, I guess, for us to turn our eyes to it. And it's always going to be different, and we don't want to have a preconceived notion of it. And to some degree, history is almost a mirage, or it's going to kind of prevent us from seeing what the truth might be.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the
can't
cave.
see it.
Yes, Sharon, that's right. I'm glad you brought up the cave, Mark, because the thing about Plato is, as a poet, he could really turn a phrase. He was great with metaphors, and some of his metaphors are just, they remain potent probably forever. I mean, will we do better than the cave? The idea that reality is right behind us. We're right there, but we're facing the wrong way, and we're looking at the shadows on the wall instead of the light that's casting it. I mean, as a metaphor for the ways in which we misunderstand the relationship between our thoughts and reality, it's just so potent. It's so potent. And you're right, it's all over this essay. Jody and then Claire.
I just wanted to, I think a better, not a better, but I think of a model for the world as in a structure is that everything is fractal. It's not spiral and it's not spinning upwards. It's because if you look at just, trees or snails or shells,
right?
It's all fractal,
right?
So you start with a small and then you keep going, and then there's a lot to be said about chaos theory, that it's not chaotic, that we have not found the system yet. However, I don't know if anybody's read the book Chaos. It was published a long time ago, but it kind of brought into philosophy the idea of what chaos can be and how it can contribute to our understanding of ourselves. So I just wanted to add that.
Oh, that's good. What if it's easy to take the models of big philosophers like Hegel for granted, as if they're part of our inheritance, and to forget sometimes that they were creatures of their age too, just like we are, and they had certain blind spots that they couldn't see characteristic, just like we have our blind spots that we can't see characteristic, that we characteristically can't see. Our own lacunae and nescience. And as a straight white cis male European intellectual of a certain age, right? That era lent itself to those kinds of people seeing a great march of history that led to themselves, right? Right. There's a reason why straight white cis male intellectuals tend to view history as a great progression that culminates in, well, us. We're so glorious and we're at the pinnacle of creation and history. So, the idea that history is a line moving, whether it's a spiral or a straight line or what have you, is the sort of metaphor that a European male straight white cis intellectual would use. And as an evolutionary scientist, I've lived through the overthrow of that model in evolution to what you're talking about, the understanding that there is no line of progress that leads to people. There's a great complicated bush of evolution that goes out in every direction in great intricacy, and that it might be that we could benefit a great deal from updating Hegel to try to express him in these more diverse, complex terms that we now understand evolution to work as. And I was struck by the beauty of your choice of fractal there, because fractal gets used a lot as sort of a throwaway, interesting thing. But in this case, it might be exactly the right metaphor, that we have a very complicated structure, right? The world with all of its different cultures and all of its different places, it can't be represented as a line. It's far more complex than that. But what's happening under modernism is that there's a pattern being developed in every place in the world. Modernism is expressing itself in Australia. It's expressing itself in India. It's expressing itself, everywhere. And so it's sort of like a fractal pattern in that some particular set of transformations is happening everywhere. Even though those places are all different, even though the preconditions that led them to where they were was different, now that they're experiencing modernism, they're all beginning to get the same interesting fractal characteristics to them. So I think, Jody, that one's going to stick with me. Thank you.
Just a quick comment, Rick, to cement your perception of yourself. Is I worked in the steel industry for a long, long time, and had to deal with a lot of people that were white and gray-haired, is how I label them. And they had a certain point of view towards a young woman that was brown from India, had dark hair, and actually could put together a sentence that made some, that was relevant and added to the conversation. So
yes.
You're one of those gray-haired Caucasian men for me.
Yeah, I've got my characteristic blinders. There's no question. It's true. Thank you. Claire, go ahead.
Oh, I think we were kind of on a different topic before originally when I raised my hand, and I kind of got a little bit skipped over, but I've been enjoying the conversation. So, but I think we were talking about food when I raised my hand. And but thinking about, just a quick question, I thought that the whole fractal thing also moved in a spiral. Now that is that right? Do I have that right imagery of the fractal? It's like moving in an outward spiral still, or no?
Well, the idea behind a fractal is that you have a pattern that's replicating upon itself multiple times. And so it can be, there are fractal spirals, but there are other kinds of fractal shapes too. It doesn't have to be a spiral, but whatever it is, it's causing some kind of a split and a characteristic reshaping. It's like, have you ever seen those weird hallucinogenic things where your fingers each become a hand with 5 fingers, like an arm? That's an example of a fractal. That's not a spiral.
But so it doesn't have to be a spiral. Oh, okay,
but it can be a spiral.
Yeah. I was thinking about food. I just wanted to give a plug to the whole food forest thing and the urban, growing vegetables. Like, this whole scarcity concept is kind of just constructed by corporations and the kind of the monster that we keep brushing against from topic to topic of politics and all these things. And this whole, like, I'm in Florida, so it's like, the St. Augustine grass is just this culture, and that was created and force fed, and that we just kind of took on. But like, the land that I have right now could potentially grow all the food that I need to eat. And again, this is coming from a place of privilege. Not everybody has access to their own land, but there's a lot of land in public space that we're just spreading herbicides and pesticides and all that stuff on that. So I just wanted to interject that it is a kind of like a force with the whole population control and like the not enough food, is that the World Health Organization has told us that the only way that we're going to sustain the population growth is if we just start doing like growing our own vegetables, you know, like we just, and it's so simple, but it's so time consuming. And a lot of the things that people think is a barrier isn't a barrier, because we've been fed like a misinformation about it. Like we can't, like you can't grow beefsteak tomatoes that you get at the store. You may be able to grow like local things like root vegetables here. So I just wanted to give a plug to people growing their own food as a way to eliminate scarcity thinking and to take out this kind of outer focal of control, like they control our food supply, when we can control our food supply. And that will actually be using our place of privilege to prevent monoculture destroying other people's environments in other countries and in our own, you know, own country as well. So I just wanted to give that a little plug and echo back thanks on all the thoughts about grace and educating our youth and traveling to expand our perspective, really being such a powerful mode of learning. And I don't know if we have time. There was something I wanted to like offer up to also to be deconstructed in a way. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know if it's like my lens or like you had said something earlier that really resonated with me about like, well, is this reality or is this my perspective? You know, and I just keep seeing these common themes between corporation, religion, and politics, and even the way that we're taking philosophy and we're taking spiritual concepts and then they're being warped by people. And it seems like it's very much cluster B personality types that are doing this kind of stuff. And maybe that's my specific perception, but the way to handle cluster B personality types is very different than handling people that are operating on a normal level, because their ego is so large, because they become so severely fractured as a child that their ego is they're running from a very strong false self. So the way to handle them is actually very different in a way. It's just a different remedy. It's not that they're all still part of us. You know, I hate this whole us versus them kind of concept, because that doesn't solve any problems is the way I see it. It's a part of all of us. Like we all have a strain that's narcissistic or a sociopath or a psychopath inside of us from a very small amount. But there's other people that it's very large parts of who they are. And these are the people that really used religion and politics as a tool for mass destruction and to pitch people against themselves, like, you know, countries against themselves. And I have this concern that we're in a state of denial and kind of disassociation from this culturally on how we need to learn how to deal with this. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what the answers are, but I'm like, well, is this just because of what I've lived through that I'm seeing this? Or it really, I can give you so many examples of this that it would be tiresome. But it just seems again and again, I'm seeing this pattern and I feel concerned, you know, like about it. And I don't know, like, or is anybody else seeing this? Is it just my little lens?
No, there's been studies that show that there's a higher rate of sociopaths and psychopaths among CEOs, and people who wield power disproportionately tend to be that way because the people who are that way want power. So they arrange their lives to seek out those opportunities. And, you know, they're getting what they want by being able to say, blah, ha, ha, I make all this money, even though it's maybe I'm selling shoddy produce, or maybe I've poisoned an aquifer for all time, but, you know, I got to get rid of my fracking waste, so my profits are up this quarter, right? It's like this kind of abstractivized reasoning where other people and the world aren't real, only the calculations I'm doing about whether I've won or not. That tends to predominate among among people who wield power. And as Nietzsche said, it's a feedback loop. Even if you weren't that way when you began wielding power, if somehow you went into it from a position of compassion and grace and wisdom, the wielding of power itself makes us stupid. And the reason is, it is the struggle with reality that teaches us to be wise. It's the struggle with reality that teaches us our limits and where the liabilities of our own character get us into trouble. And if we remove all those liabilities, or rather, if we remove the consequences of those liabilities, if we create a situation in which we can paper over our consequences with power or money, then instead of detecting the problem of our liabilities, we make it invisible to ourselves. Because now it's not really a problem for us. I mean, sure, somebody else suffered, but it didn't affect me. So I'm unlikely to learn the lesson I need to learn to change to be a better person. This is the mechanism by which Nietzsche's argument that power makes stupid operates. Is that power makes our bad sides invisible to us while magnifying them for everybody else, right? Because the less we're concerned about our liabilities, our character-wide liabilities, the more likely we are to act upon them. And of course, our power allows us to magnify the impact that it has upon others. So it becomes a feedback loop. It becomes a feedback.
And it is a feedback loop. Most people have like a moral center of like a remorse and empathy that but it becomes so a healthy person can actually get corrupted by power and do nasty things. But then there's some people that because of childhood trauma, they fractured off the part of them that will allow them to feel empathy and remorse.
Right.
And they can become, and then if they get power, they're really like a super force. They're like the big villain kind of people that we've seen in history, where it's kind of like when their IQ is really high and they know how to speak to people that are easily manipulated, and how to, speak in a way that really conjures up their emotions and their fears and all that kind of stuff. It gets to be a feedback loop that can't be broken in the same way that the consequences can come back to normal people. In other words, like normal people, you could reason with them. You could show them, okay, well, this had bad consequences for somebody because of this is the river it destroyed, or these are the fish it killed, or these the children are starving. And then they would go, oh my God, I didn't know it did that. And then they would feel bad. But it's like there's just not that thing there. And it's like, what point in society and as our consciousness evolving, or this fractal or spiral or chaos, are we gonna like learn this lesson that we need to deal with whatever this problem is, or just confront it? I've been feeling anxious about it, I think. And it may just be what's going on right now this week.
What's going on right now is a clear object lesson for what you're talking about. And I don't know if you've read the biography written by his niece, but her argument in that bio is exactly what you're saying, that he had a terrible upbringing. He was emotionally abused. It caused him to lack compassion and to want to act out against other people. And his fondest dream was to get into a position where he had the power to do that. And so now she says what's happening is that the whole world is living inside the Trump household that he was living in when he was a little boy growing up. We're all experiencing the abuse and the lack of compassion.
And the irony is that it creates an environment where people feel like they need to fight fire with fire. And it creates an environment where it almost like everyone needs to step up their own nice narcissism and psychopathy to deal with it, which is one of the reasons why the debate was so painful to watch, because that was, they were trying to almost fight fire with fire. And I don't know whether it works. I think there's like I can't remember that it's like a Polynesian story where the ice goddess eats the fire goddess. And I can't really pull out why I always think about that, but I think there's something to it. It's like fighting fire with fire doesn't always work, but I think we have to be like very calmly present with what's going on, because I think he's a very intelligent man. And I think that people that people that have that much power, that enjoy power, don't like to give it up. And there's been these kind of dialogues about the voter fraud and this kind of stuff. And I feel like he's pushing because it's a binary system, pushing the other side into this dialogue to defend the voting. Where if he has some of his people do it, the other side has been pushed into a corner defending that mail-in voting is correct, which is intentional, because I'm like, I have this fear, well, if all he needs is voter fraud in a few states, and then he's kept his power. But even if he goes away, he's not going away, because the dialogue is still in the hearts of so many Americans. And I just think that we're not looking at it collectively for what it is, where those roots in trauma, whether there needs to be a revolution of mental health and a mental and emotional health, that we start to address this as a society. I feel like there's a lot of cries for help from that. I don't know how that applies in philosophy.
So let me circle it back around for you. Let me pull it into this essay, because what you're talking about is here. It's in this essay. And part of what he's saying is that as moderns, we take for granted the idea that modernism is healthy and normal, right? People in the pandemic are talking about, I can't wait until the pandemic's over and I can go back to my normal life.
Oh yeah, forget it.
The way that things were was sustainable and healthy and normal. We take it for granted. It's an assumption. It's a cross between an assumption and an article of faith. Most of us are not prepared to have that be questioned. And many people will get quite angry if you question the idea that modernism is any kind of normal or healthy thing. It's a specific phenomena at a specific time. And until we can look at it objectively from outside of itself, we won't be able to diagnose it, because we don't know which of its features truly are normal, because they all seem normal to us, and which ones are weird and idiosyncratic and might help to explain why it is different from the previous eras that operated the way that they operated. So what he's doing in this essay is trying to get us to where we can look from 3 different perspectives, and also get the idea that there's a lot more out there, if we can find them, that we could try to develop and document and learn how to mode shift into, so that we can get to a position where we can figure out what are our circumstances, how did we get here, and what our options are. And what he's saying basically is, until we do that work of seeing, of achieving an Archimedean standpoint, of stepping outside of modernism to look back at modernism, to be able to see it for the first time as it truly is, and not as it felt to us, or not as we thought about it when we were trapped inside of it, we won't be able to create the revolution that would make things fundamentally different, because we don't know how things fundamentally are. Like this is we quote Hegel a lot on these talks, but Hegel says whatever's familiar to us is for that very reason not recognized as what it is, because familiarity is the process of taking for granted things that we shouldn't take for granted. Things that are interesting and distinctive instead kind of fade into the background, and we stop thinking about them and just assume that that's how the world has to be. And our problem is, when we're trying to diagnose modernism, is that our frame of reference for diagnosis is health versus unhealth, but we don't know what health looks like. We only know what the status quo looks like, healthy or unhealthy. So we've got this perspective problem. And that's what he's trying to do here, is to help us develop the uncomfortable but highly useful art of developing additional perspectives, so that eventually we'll be able to look back at modernism and go, oh, that's what it is. Okay, that definitely has to change. Dana, I see you got your hand up.
First, I'm going to relinquish to, I don't know how to say her name,
Jody,
because she's been wanting to speak for a minute. And then I really, really want to say something.
Okay, Jody, then Dana.
Goes from the paper to the essay to this.
You got it.
Oh, I'm sorry it's so loud. I'm outside. What I wanted to say was that as far as consequences are concerned, the consequences have become so removed from the person that's from the doer that there are no consequences for the doer. The consequences are for some completely other, set of, if you want to say people, you want to say nature, whatever you want to say.
That's like privilege in a nutshell, right?
Mm-hmm,
To be privileged just to mean somebody else inherits your consequences.
Exactly. So, and also the idea of power being, you know, the psychoanalysis of someone that has power being a sociopath or a psychopath. There's a lot of mental health issues there, because one of the ways of dealing with, you know, just what happens in your youth is anger. You know, one of the mechanisms is anger, because you're not being noticed, or you're not getting attention, you're not getting unjudgmental hearing. So the only way to get heard is to be angry and
Right.
throw a tantrum.
Right.
So that eventually develops into aggression, and you're aggressive about whatever you're doing. So, you know, if we were to talk about some of the CEOs, they're very, very aggressive to mediate for that, you know, survival technique of anger that they used when they were whatever, under 7. However, I also want to say that, you know, corporations have gotten so big that they're almost bigger than government, and hence the consequence is so far away from the person affected. But I just wanted to mention one example. I go to Baltimore often for some medical attention, and I am just amazed at what the CEO of Under Armour is doing for that city. Is all of a sudden, that's the only corporation that I see is actually has respect and is trying to understand the consumer that is consuming their products, and how they can uplift and what they can contribute to from their profits, because they're making so much profits, but you know, they're making the profits based on their consumer. So they're putting in all kinds of spaces and environments where Black and white people can meet. It's not forced, it's just an environment, and people go there and they meet naturally, rather than the segregated spaces that we have created. So I was very, very impressed by that. And I hope that other CEOs and corporations follow something like that. And as consumers, we can do that by supporting and knowing the products that we are consuming. And also, if we want to take responsibility for what we are consuming, it might be a good idea to, you know, look around and see where you can make a significant difference, where the consequence is immediately apparent. Like this bakery I was talking about, you know?
Right.
It's just a mom and pop shop, conglomeration of different cultures working together and presenting something that is beautiful to the community. And it's right next to whatever, a P. Terry's, or I don't know, HEB making donuts, you know, selling donuts, 13 donuts for $2. I'm like, okay, but we have that power in our hands, because a lot of us are privileged, and we owe that because of our privilege. You know, it's not just everybody else, it's not the other, it's a lot of us too.
Right. Thank you, Jody. Dana, go ahead.
So I want to take what Claire was talking about. I put in the chat a video, a seminar, actually, a science seminar that I think would be just like poof for you. You'd love it. But beginning to end, yeah, awesome. I just saw it Friday night. but I took a class like 34 years ago, and they called it Western civilization. Okay, so this man, older man, teaching it, clearly now I realize, was really a philosopher at heart. You know, he was a historian. He was a philosopher at heart. So I'm listening to this class, and what this was about. We talked a lot about Rome, of course, and why did Rome fall, and what happened, and da 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 and da da da. And I'm listening to him, and government and law were in this class what Christianity is in this essay. So if we were to take the USA and Rome, and we were to look at governance and law, and how we have taken law and made an upside down pyramid so that the common man can't even understand it. Same with access to food, so on and so on and so on and so on. So we've created this society so that the common man starts to become more and more and more disenfranchised, less and less loyal to the ivory tower or dome, you know, and the people who are getting empowered feel more and more entitled, right? So much so that, you know, they're like going to vomit their meal to have more, or take diuretics and or you know, something to have diarrhea the next day so that they can eat whatever they want and drink whatever they want. Some, you know, do drugs and stuff and fly overseas and have dialysis. You know, the Rolling Stones did that for ages. Privilege, that's like privilege we don't, I'm on disability, you know, like that we don't even get. But and I listen, and he never wants anything at all. He just taught it. But I saw it. So I went up to him and I'm like, okay, am I crazy? Or are you describing the United States? Because we talked even about like the barbarians that came in and, oh, well, we can just absorb them and they'll become part of our culture. They'll behave as we do if they come here. So they were essentially their immigrants. And instead, they brought their cultures. They go into these homes that were huge and marble, and they'd make their fire in the middle of the living room and cook the way they always did. They didn't care about the kitchen. They didn't care. And so this is the kind of thing that just kind of permeated. And so the common man became more and more in touch with the earth, the dirt, what we need to survive, and less connected, involved, less voting and all this. We see more right now because we're being rabble roused to just think, you know, both sides are just evil. So no matter what happens, it's not that they're bad, wrong, are gonna get something, they're evil. We're the Democrats and they're the you know, ass hats, and there you go. So it's all moot, because here's the law. None of us can touch the law by ourselves very readily and safely. And the same with food. We have to, you know, the corporations created the work hours and what they expect of the employee at the 21-year-old young male. So you bring in a 56-year-old male, you can no longer age in place in your job. You know, you like end up having to be, I see you, Joy, and you know, so that's another law. That's another form of law, is policy and procedure. So there's these, my best friend lives in Lagos, Nigeria, where the massacre just happened. You want to get your privilege down all the time. Have a best friend that lives in Nigeria. Mm-hmm. Straightens you right out. and wow. But so yeah, there's a reason to be nervous because we're not connected to our governance, and it's supposed to be by the people. Supposed to be. Never really was, but it's really far now. It might straighten out. We made it through Goldwater. The country did. But what we might not make it through are the policy and procedures and the lawsuits and the need for insurance and liability and the lack of loyalty of employer to employee and employee to employer, which my grandfather had, right? My grandfather had that. And now I said courtesy to a 26-year-old, and she said, "What's that?" The world has changed.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
It really happened. Yeah, why did courtesy die? What's that? A lot of people young asked me, like, no, I don't get it. Anyway, so I wanted to put together like that dynamic that he's talking about. Smith, right?
Kenneth Smith.
In this essay, we can take to other cultures and other dynamics and see the same crunch and the same lack of connection to, like she said, about consequences, and the same disconnect. And eventually that disconnect gets so far that it's like this. And then the people go.
Right. Yeah. The perfected condition that power elites seek out, thinking that it's the thing they want more than anything, to not have to be accountable at all to the people, is what creates a society in which their actions don't benefit most people, and most people start to hate them. And then you have a revolution, and the power elite's overthrown because they got what they wanted, which was to not pay any attention to what the people want. This is like, the French Revolution. The lesson that we always learn is the people who are desperately trying to maximize their fortunes. Well, when society is the most polarized between the haves and the have-nots, is when the haves lose everything. It's the thing that they're working the hardest for, unbeknownst to them, is their own overthrow. That's what history tells us, right? That's one of the circles we keep coming back around on. And it's ironic, and it's philosophical and Heraclitean and all kinds of other things. But to invert that and talk about it from the perspective of, well, what is the rest of us supposed to do? I want to put together what you said and what Claire said and what Mark said, and put it together with Kenneth Smith in the following way. The idea is this, that Plato's analogy of the cave is right on, right? We have to assume at any given time that you're not seeing things exactly the way they really are, that there's a difference between Claire's version of reality and Mark's version of reality and Jody's version of reality and my version of reality and everybody else's. There are all these competing realities, and we can't see each other's realities. We mostly see our own reality and filter the world through it and think that that's the way things actually are. One of the terms that Kenneth Smith uses is actuality, which he reserves for the way things actually are, that we don't get to know exactly how that is. The only thing we know about it is it's not exactly the way we think it is, right? It's not exactly the way anybody thinks it is. Actuality is true in and of itself, regardless of whether we're aware of it or not. And some parts of it we're guaranteed not to be aware of right now. So there's a tension between the many, many realities that every different person, contributes one of, and the single actuality that we have in common. Heraclitus wrote about this. He said that the great struggle that human beings have in understanding what's true and what's not is that even though our realities are like a little dream world and we're sleepwalking through life and we can't negotiate our problems if we keep focusing on our private realities, what we should be doing is turning to look at the shared actuality and using that as a basis for coming to agreements. What actually do we need together? What actually is the state of the world? But instead, our reflex, drawn by our ego, is to turn back inward and go, well, I don't want to hear about the way you see things. I just want to tell you the way I see things. And then I want to try to equate that with actuality and claim that my reality is actually so. So we're sort of like what we call consciousness, according to Heraclitus and Kenneth Smith, is like another layer of unconsciousness. It's another subconscious layer. It's a waking dream that has some things in common with actuality and some things that are not. And it's different for all of us. So this creates a problem for us. In Plato's cave, the idea is that despite the fact that we're sort of relating to the world indirectly through our hallucinating dream state, we are nevertheless looking in the direction of the world. As Plato says, the real light is right behind us. We are there. We're just not oriented towards it correctly in order to take actions that are good for us. This is what Marx called false consciousness. That you can be living through an experience of profound meaning and profound impact, but misinterpret it so completely that you take actions that are against your best interests, but you think they're in your best interests, because in the version of the world in your head, they would have been in your best interests. It's just you're not living in that world. You're living in the actual world where things are different. So the way this knits together, Claire talks about the power that we have to get control over our food supply. Now, how much of our lives is manipulated by our access to nutrition, right? A significant amount. We have to work and raise money to get the money that we need to go to the grocery store and buy the food, without which we'll starve to death and die. So if we want to liberate ourselves from this leash, one of the many things that we should be doing is starting to take an interest in where our food comes from, starting to form relationships with farmers that we want to support, with businesses that we think are behaving ethically, to use Jody's terminology, and more importantly, to do a little bit of the growing ourselves, to learn that art that our lives depend upon, so that we're not 100% at the mercy of other people who don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. You see what I mean? There's this sense in which we are taught that our proper role is a passive role. Our job is to accept the world the way it is, and to fit into the rules that have been set aside for us, and do the things that we're supposed to do by recipe, and that we shouldn't try to change anything. It's outside our control. It's too big. We can't actually change it. We're doomed. It's fated. We're helpless. Smarter people than us have made the decisions. They don't need us to make the decisions. We should just shut up and stay in our place. The list is endless, but I'm going to add a few more here that are really important, because people who get into philosophy often fall prey to these. The forces of history will solve the problem for us, so we don't need to. You heard that one? Right? History has a great pattern. There are great forces at work, and those forces will eventually lead to the right outcomes. I'm going to quote Martin Luther King Jr. here. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That's Martin Luther King. He's saying that it will go to justice eventually on its own. Now, he wasn't trying to say that. He was trying to say we should all get out and engage in direct action to change the world, but it slipped out in the middle of a great speech. This impulse that we're all taught to just sort of take things as they are and to assume that they will work out without our engagement, and that really we're not really needed. You also see this with people who say we're all doomed. You heard that one? We're all doomed. Everything's in collapse. There's nothing we can do about it. You notice what that has in common with the other things? Passivity, right? The modern era is just as happy for us to believe that we're all doomed as it is for us to believe everything's perfect and we should just go along with the way things are, because they both lead to the same outcome, which is we don't do anything to change things, right? We just stay passive and we stay in our roles. So to grow food, right, is active. It's to go against the flow. It's to do something that society doesn't demand that we do, and would be perfectly happy if we never did at all, but that has an impact on our lives, and that connects us to nature and the world at a physical level, so that we actually understand we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And we don't just understand it, we feel it, right? When you look at this essay and you look at the three epochs he's talking about, the medieval epoch, the ancient epoch, and the modern epoch, what's interesting about them is that the Christian ethos of grace and the Hellenic ethos of fate are both built around the idea that the proper role for a human being is active. We should act to make things better. We should act because God calls us to act, and or we should act to overcome the liabilities of our character and try to make a better world. But in either case, we should act. We have to engage. We have to struggle, and we have to try to create change to make things better than they would otherwise turn out. It's the modern era that tells almost all of us that really our activity is not required. And if we get out there and try to engage too much, we might find police forces out there tear gassing us and hitting us with clubs and telling us to go back home like good little civilians and be passive, because the modern world would like us to be passive. It's characteristic of modernism that only the few get to be active. The rest of us are supposed to just blend in. So a theme that's come up over and over during the seminar today is, what is Kenneth Smith saying we're supposed to do? What is his prescription? And I mentioned before the idea that his prescription is just this arrow. He's not telling you where we end up. He's telling you to become active. That the reason we want to cultivate multiple perspectives is to understand that the things we take for granted are things that we react to passively. And then we're unable to lift ourselves up to do better. It's by getting these additional perspectives that we see that we have more choices through travel, through cosmopolitanism, through diversity, through culture exchange. We start to understand that we could be choosing differently than what we have now. And that encourages us to choose, to act, to do, to become active agents in the world. So when he talks about Christian spirit in the section on grace, he's not just talking about otherworldliness or the idea of a ghost or a soul. He's also talking about the difference between soul and spirit is that when you have spirit, you stop being passive and you start to act to try to do the right thing. And that spirit, whether you believe it's supernatural or whether you believe it's natural, it doesn't matter. The important part is that it activates us to engage with the world and change the world for the better. And that I'd say is pretty close to the heart of what Kenneth Smith is trying to get us to do here. He's saying, look at this. One of the characteristics of what we take for granted as healthy and normal is that it makes us be unhealthy and abnormal in how passive we are and how much we feel like we're just helpless pawns in a great machine, shouldn't really bother. He says that is the thing we should question more than anything else.
Rick, a quick question. Sorry, I'm on the road. Based on this, what would you hypothesize Kenneth Smith's take on the web would be? Because it's connected people, it's given agency to the common man, so-called. However, it's also given ignorance to, or cemented ignorance. Like you can just talk to people that you want to talk to, which I guess you would do in person too, but now you can do collectively across the world. So I'm just curious what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I think ironic wry amusement is Kenneth's reaction to most things, including the web, which is like, on the one hand, it's a mix of all this potential and some of which comes to pass, and we get to meet each other and talk. And the mailing list that David and I, got to experience with Kenneth in the early 2000s was all because of email and because of the internet. So, big fans. But at exactly the same time, the internet's being used as a way to homogenize and for ultra-right groups to organize and for the government to monitor everything that we think and say. It's like, it's not just good or just bad. It is in, like everything else in the modern world, it's a nearly complete reflection of the contradictions within our society. It's a mix of the good and the bad.
So it's a tool that we can use either positively or negatively.
Yeah, and that
we have the power to do that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that at present we are using both positively and negatively.
Mm-hmm.
And,
there was one other thing I wanted to say that came out in your summary.
Shoot.
Wish I could remember. Give me a second.
Well, if only we were going to do this again next Monday. Oh, wait.
Okay, I'll drop it. I can't think of it right now.
It'll come back. We'll be here.
It will. Yeah.
I don't have any objection if we wanted to roll over to another week if there's enough here.
Okay, guys, I got to go. Thank you so much for a beautiful discussion. Thank you, Rick, and
Thanks,
everybody
everybody.
else. Bye-bye.
Thanks for being here, Jyoti.
Hi, Jyoti.
We want to do another week of this one. Is there enough here?
Good to meet you. I don't know. Maybe there's not.
Yeah.
Or what did you have in mind?
I have to finish reading it.
I think we should do it again. And this time we've gotten through the structure of it and the overall high level stuff. But next time we could really get into some of his stuff about spirit versus soul and the nature of freedom and some of these things that he really explored in this.
Yeah, there's a lot in here for sure.
Sorry. I'll mute. Yeah, like that's a whole level I would love to, listen to and hear even more names of more philosophers because I went down the medical and science track. And so always wanted to do this one. Couldn't afford the time to do both or money.
Yeah.
So you're my class.
Well, then let's do that. It's my class too. I'm always learning.
As an introvert, this pandemic has opened up entire universes to me that I did not have access to. So for that little piece, with all the sorrow I have, I'm going to celebrate. So it's wonderful to meet you all from all over.
Likewise.
Thanks for letting me share.
Our pleasure. All right, let's call that a wrap for this week. Thanks, David.
Yeah, sure. Rick, everybody come to our Monday night study group. And I also have the open forum if anybody wants to stop by for there.
Have a great week, everyone.
Yeah, okay. See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.